This is a video presentation of a full explanation of the story of Umineko no Nakokoro ni. A couple of months ago I made a video called Umineko Explained after reading the first 4 novels. In this video, however, I'm going to deal with the entire story, in other words all 8 novels together. If you have read all 8 novels and haven't seen my first video, I would actually advise you to not watch the original first. The reason for that is because my position has slightly changed since then, and since this video will contain all relevant information from the original one. If you haven't read all 8 novels or have only seen the anime version, I actually do advise you to watch my original Umineko Explained video, because this video is specifically aimed at people who have read all 8 novels, and therefore I will assume in this video that the viewer has read all 8 novels and knows the entire story. So if you have read all 8 novels, then you would pretty much know what the truth behind the story is supposed to be, even though it isn't told in a very straightforward fashion. So it may seem like such a thorough explanation video is pretty redundant if the truth behind the story has already been revealed. After all, the author of the story, known as Ryukashi07, pretty much confirmed who the real culprit is in interviews. But in a minute you will understand why this video is very necessary. So let's first summarize in a nutshell what the official explanation is supposed to be. In other words, what the whodunit, howdunit and whydunit of the story were according to the author, at least in regards of what he confirmed in interviews and what would be the most straightforward interpretation of especially the 7th novel. The official explanation is that the true culprit of Umineko is Shannon, who also happens to be the same person as Canon. Both are personalities of a person referred to as Yasu, who is the secret child of Kinzo and the Kuwadorian Beatrice, also known as Leon. This Yasu character is also the quote-unquote witch Beatrice, who appeared on the island and who is responsible for the murders. All of Yasu's personalities have or had a relationship with one of the Yoshiromiya cousins. Beatrice to Battler, Shannon to George and Canon to Jessica. In 1986, Yasu committed the mass murder in order to decide everyone's fate, to see which persona, if any, would live on to experience love with their significant other. Yasu committed all the murders herself, but had Genji, Kumasawa and Dr. Nanjo as accomplices, plus extra accomplices who differ from game to game. In order to commit the murders, Yasu relied heavily on the ability to switch between her Shannon and Canon persona, since they both share the same body. This is also referred to by fans as the Shikanon-Tris theory. If you have also read some interviews with the author Ryukashi, you would know that he basically confirms this, so we can basically refer to this explanation as the quote-unquote official explanation. So from now on, when I use the term the official explanation, you know what I'm referring to. I will also refer to the culprit of the official explanation as Shannon rather than Yasu. This is to avoid confusion later on, which will become clear later in the video. So now we have clear what the official explanation of Umineko is supposed to be, I will tell you what my position is. I believe that the official explanation is a lie. Yes, you heard that correctly. I believe that the author Ryukashi is deceiving his readers into believing a false explanation. Now that's a pretty bold statement, but I will make yet another bold statement. I can prove beyond reasonable doubt that the official explanation is a deception. In other words, I am strongly convinced that Ryukashi is trying to deceive his readers into believing that Shannon and Canon are the same person, that Shannon is the same person as Yasu, and that therefore Shannon is Beatrice and the true culprit. In other words, I believe that it's false that Shannon and Canon are the same person. That it's false that Shannon is the same person as Yasu. That it's false that Shannon is Beatrice. That it's false that Shannon is the true culprit. That it's false that Yasu is an actual existing human being who has ever been really present on the island or anywhere else. And, of course, that I can prove that all these things are false. Now I want to make it very clear that it's not my position that the author made a mistake. So I am not claiming that Ryukashi really meant the Shikanon-Tris explanation to be the truth behind the story, but that he simply made a mistake, making the official explanation inconsistent with the facts found in the story itself. I don't believe for a second that someone as brilliant as Ryukashi would make such a mistake. My position is that Ryukashi is purposefully deceiving the readers about what the truth behind the story is supposed to be. Just like the Umineko story for the most part consists of the author deceiving his readers, I believe that he is continuing this deception until the very end of the story and even in interviews. Now I perfectly well understand how incredibly controversial and unorthodox it is to go against the author himself, but I ask you all to have an open mind here and just to be willing to at least consider this possibility. And I think you have two good reasons for being open-minded about this possibility. 1. Deception towards the readers on the author's part is an inherent part of the story, and 2. The official explanation has never been proven in red. Think about it, the vast majority of the Umineko story is about the author deceiving the readers. After all, none of the magical scenes truly take place. It's all about seeing the truth beneath the illusion of magic. So even though it might be really hard to imagine the author keeping his deception going until the very end of the story, and even in interviews, it is at least something that should be considered. But of course the first reason why you would be skeptical towards my claim that Ryukishi is lying is that you cannot imagine why he would do such a thing. However, I will not go into Ryukishi's motives for lying until very late in the video. This may seem strange, but I have the following reason for doing that. Since my position will be regarded as quote-unquote blasphemy by many fans of Umineko, and also believe that the official explanation really is the truth, most people will probably not even want to consider the possibility that they might have been deceived into believing a false explanation. So the only way I think it would be possible to break through such a barrier is to first demonstrate that the official explanation is necessarily false and incoherent. Because unless I show some massive amount of evidence that the official explanation has to be wrong in the first place, and then put an alternative explanation in its place that does account for all the facts in the story, unless I do that first, I don't think that any of you will believe me in the first place. Most of you will probably think that I'm crazy anyway for going against the author himself, and most of you will probably think that the evidence for the official explanation is extremely strong. So I will first have to focus on disproving the official explanation. And once I've broken it down to the ground, I will build up a new theory in its place that is possible, plausible, coherent, is consistent with all read statements and all circumstantial evidence, accounts for the who done it, how done it and why done it, accounts for the Yasu character, for how the murders tie into Battler's sin against Shannon, and is quote-unquote elegant. What I mean by the term elegant is a theory that relies on as few unprovable assumptions as possible. It also doesn't incorporate arbitrary accomplices without evidence. It also doesn't attempt to work around the meaning of read statements. In other words, the read statements are taken at face value. They simply mean what they say without doublespeak. In other words, the theory is judged by the read statements instead of the theory being the judge on how the read statements are supposed to be interpreted. The second approach is an unreasonable way of handling the read in my opinion. However, if you believe in the official explanation, you are essentially forced to do this. So at the very least, I can present you with another possible truth inside the cat box that cannot be denied. However, as I said, I will do more than that. I will also show that the official explanation never could have existed inside the cat box to begin with. In fact, it is my position that the evidence against the official explanation is so strong and so devastating that at the end of this video I will present you with the following challenge. After you finish this video, you will have to believe one of the following things. You agree with me that the official explanation is a deception and never meant to be the real truth behind the story, or you would have to believe that the author screwed up his own story in which the truth behind the story is incoherent, inconsistent and contradicts the rules he gave to his own story. So it is truly my position that the official explanation cannot be defended on the basis of evidence from the actual story itself. It can only appeal to author's authority. But if the author is lying in the first place, then no such appeal can be made. So to summarize my position and to keep it in the spirit of the story, I will present two blue statements. I can demonstrate that the official explanation is false due to many factual conflicts, including conflicting read statements. I can provide an alternative explanation that is possible, plausible and consistent with all the facts and all read statements, which includes the who done it, the how done it and the why done it behind all of the murders. This explanation also includes the Yasu character of the 7th novel and her relation to Shannon. Now all that is left before I will give you the outline of this series is to tell you who are the people involved in my own explanation. So during this video I will falsify the official explanation and defend my own theory. I will also put these two explanations next to each other regarding various scenarios and show why my theory almost in all cases fits better than the official explanation. So before I will give you the outline of the video, I will first present to you the people involved in my explanation, which is a group of 2 culprits and 1 accomplice. The main culprit, who also is Beatrice, is Rosa. The second culprit is George. And their non-murdering accomplice is Dr. Nanjo. I can explain the entire story, including the whodunit and the Yasu-Leon stuff of the 7th novel, with just these 3 individuals. This of course doesn't include the 6, 7 and 8 games in which there are different culprits, namely Erika Frudo in the 6th game, Rudolf and Kyrie in the 7th, and with Battler as the 3rd culprit in the 8th game. Also in the 3rd game, Kraus and Itsui get killed by Eva. For the people who have seen my original video, the main difference between my final theory and my theory back in the original video is that my original theory was very much centered around George, while my final theory is centered mostly around Rosa. So in my original video I had George as the main culprit and Rosa as the second culprit. By now it's the other way around. So now I will give you the outline of this video, which will consist of 12 chapters. In the first chapter I will disprove all of the supposed evidence in favor of Shannon and Cannon being the same person, and will present evidence against Shannon and Cannon being the same person, which includes read statements that demonstrate that they are separate individual human beings. In chapter 2 I present what I call my fictional Yasu theory. Here I demonstrate that Yasu and Leon cannot be the same individual and that neither of them are real living human beings in the first place. However, my fictional Yasu theory is not a denial of the importance of the Yasu character. In fact, I believe that Yasu is one of the most important characters in order to understand the whodunit of the story. In chapter 3 I provide evidence against Shannon being Beatrice, including a read statement. I also present more than a dozen arguments in favor of Rosa being Beatrice. In chapter 4 I show Rosa's and George's motives and their connection. Also how Rosa is connected to Battler's sin against Shannon. I also show why Dr. Nanjo agreed to be their accomplice. In chapter 5 I present what I call my betrayal and scapegoat theories. The betrayal theories are about the reason everyone dies in the end, especially why it is that Shannon dies. Here I also explain the furniture's love battle in the 6th novel. The scapegoat theory is about the reason that Natsui gets framed in the 5th game. In chapter 6 I show that George is the culprit in the 5th game and explain how he did it and why. 7 will be a short chapter about the meaning of the gold truth. Chapter 8 will be a very long and very extensive chapter in which I will go through all of the murder scenarios of the first 4 games and explain all of them with Rosa and George as culprits and Dr. Nanjo as the single accomplice. In chapter 9 I will finally arrive at one of the most important points of my video, namely why Ryukishi would be lying about the truth behind the story in the first place. I will also show that there were several hints within the story that suggested this, as well as in interviews, and even what are probably on purpose discrepancies between the novel version and the anime version. In chapter 10 I will deal with the little booklet called Umineko Our Confession and what the purpose of this edition is. In chapter 11 I will discuss the nature of Enji's future perspective and my theory that it's a counterfactual future timeline from a largely fictional perspective. And in the final chapter I will explain the nature of the meta world and the nature of quote-unquote magic. So that's the outline of my video. So now let's move on to the first chapter in which I will disprove the Shikanon deception. After all, this is almost the jugular vein of the official explanation. If I can demonstrate that Shannon and Cannon are separate individual human beings and not mere personalities of a single human being, then the official explanation will quickly start to crumble. The so-called Shikanon theory is a term that fans of Umineko use to refer to the notion that Shannon and Cannon are actually the same individual, namely Yasu wearing 2 different disguises. But if I can disprove that, anyone who believes the official explanation would really need to rethink their entire perspective on the story. So let's first outline what the supposed evidence in favor of the Shikanon theory is. The even if you do join us there are only 17 people red statement, the final red statement made against Erica in the 6th novel. The logic error solution of the 6th game. Cannon's disappearance from the sealed cousin's room and the chained guest room. Shannon and Cannon never appear in front of Battler at the same time. This also includes the fact that Cannon's corpse disappears both in the 2nd and in the 4th game. The when Shannon is killed, Cannon goes missing forever statement from the 8th novel, supplemented by a red statement that Cannon is now treated as being killed and Lambda Delta saying that's what happens when Shannon dies. And finally, the incomplete souls of Shannon, Cannon and Beatrice. Only one of them will be able to experience love, and this is connected to the Furniture's love battle in the 6th novel. This may seem like an overwhelming amount of powerful evidence in favor of the Cannon theory. So I can understand why so many people believe Shannon and Cannon to be the same person. However, I can disprove all of these supposed evidences. So let's start with the first piece of supposed evidence, namely the final red statement of the 6th game, when Beatrice defeated Erica by solving Battle's logic error. Erica had one final red statement before she was destroyed, which was the following. Hi, pleased to meet you. I am Frudo Erica, the detective. I may be an uninvited guest, but please welcome me. I am the visitor, the 18th human on Rokkinjima. To which Battle responds, sorry, but even if you do join us, there are 17 people. So what is basically suggested here, especially given that this occurs right after the logic error was solved, is that even if Erica joins the group, there are still only 17 people on the island. In other words, since Shannon and Cannon are the same person, the original amount of people on the island was 16, and adding Erica to that would make 17 instead of 18. Sounds nice and all. Unfortunately, this explanation is 100% completely impossible. Not just that it happens to be false, it is impossible. Now why is that? Well, let's explain it in the following way. The Cannon theory is never proven in red, but let's imagine what a hypothetical red statement would look like that would show Shannon and Cannon to be the same person. It would be something like this. Shannon and Cannon are the same person. Or Shannon and Cannon are one person. Another example would be if their names would be given in a group of people, yet the amount of people would be one less than the amount of names. A hypothetical example of that would be something like this. Shannon, Cannon, Kraus, Kyrie and Goda, this group consists of 4 people. This is in alignment with the supposed evidence for the Cannon theory that there are only 17 people if Erica joins the group. So every Cannon believer would have to agree with this. Also, if one of these statements would ever have been made in the story, would any Cannon believer then say something like, oh no, this doesn't really mean anything, these are ambiguous statements and can mean anything? Obviously not. So if you turn that around, this means that the hypothetical red statement disproving the notion that Shannon and Cannon are one individual would look like this. Shannon and Cannon are not the same person, or Shannon and Cannon are 2 persons or 2 people. And another example would be if their names would be given in a group and the amount of people in that group would be the same as the amount of names. A hypothetical example of that would be something like this. Shannon, Cannon, Kraus, Kyrie and Goda, this group consists of 5 people. What we also need to know is what the definition of the word people is in Umineko. So is the word people actually ever defined? Yes, it is in fact. It gets defined just moments earlier in the same novel, namely the following. Quote, confirming definition. Can I accept 3 people to refer to the numbers of bodies? You're saying that 3 bodies went in and out of the room, right? And then in red, of course, 3 people, in other words, 3 bodies went in or out. Only you and Cannon entered and only Battle left. It has already been said in red that all people can only use their own names. Therefore the names Erica, Battler and Cannon can only be used by those people. So here we see that the word people is equivalent to living human bodies. And so far no believer in the Cannon theory would have any objections, because that is again exactly what the even if you do join us there are 17 people statement seems to suggest. There were originally 16 human bodies on the island, since Shannon and Cannon share the same body, and Erica then becomes the 17th body on the island, or in other words, the 17th person. In other words, the word people is not equivalent to personality. Even if someone had multiple personalities, they would not be considered to be multiple people, since people refers to their bodies, not the amount of personalities. So that means that if the Shannon theory is true, and if the "there are 17 people" statement really is a statement proving this, then Canon and Shannon could never be defined as two people, since they share the same body. If it is indeed Yasu wearing two different disguises, then Shannon and Canon are only one among the people on the island, meaning one body. In other words, if Shannon and Canon are ever identified in red as two people, or if their names increase the list of people by 2 instead of 1, then the Shannon theory is impossible. So I'm going straight for the jugular vein here. All I need to do is show a red statement in which Shannon and Canon are identified as two people, and the Shannon theory is necessarily false given the rules of the story. Let's also include the word person to make sure. And I can in fact show 4 red statements that meet these conditions. The first one is a red statement concerning the 6 linked closed room chain from the third game. Quote, 6 people, Kinzo, Genji, Shannon, Canon, Goda and Kumasawa are dead. So here we got 6 names identified as 6 people, and Shannon and Canon are among them. In other words, Shannon and Canon are 2 people, and this is reaffirmed by Eva Beatrice when she makes her list of 15 dead people. She says the following: Kinzo is dead, Kraus is dead, Natsui is dead, Hideyoshi is dead, George is dead, Rudolph is dead, Kiria is dead, Rosa is dead, Maria is dead, Genji is dead, Shannon is dead, Canon is dead, Goda is dead, Kumasawa is dead, Nanjo is dead. The 15 people mentioned are dead. And as you can see, there are 15 names in this list. And there's yet another red statement concerning Canon from the 4th game. Among the 5 people in Kiria's group, he, which is referring to Canon, was the first to die. The group that this statement refers to consists of Canon, Shannon, Dr. Nanjo, Kraus and Kirie. Shannon and Canon are also implicitly defined as separate persons, namely in the 2nd game when Beatrice made a red statement regarding the master keys. The only master keys are the ones that each servant holds, 1 per person. So what we see here is that there is 1 master key per person who is a servant, and this is again confirmed in the 3rd game when Battler asks how many master keys there are, to which Beatrice responds, there are 5, 1 for each servant. There are only 5 master keys. So this means that there are 5 servants and each of them is carrying one of the 5 master keys. The 5 servants are also defined as 5 persons. Shannon and Canon both are servants who carry master keys. Therefore, Shannon and Canon are 2 persons. If the Shannon theory was true, Yasu would be carrying 2 master keys, but the first red statement denies that possibility. You also can't claim that there are only 4 master keys, since it's both confirmed in red that there are 5. And we also see all 5 of them together from the objective perspective in the servants' room scenario in the 2nd game. So by this we can demonstrate 2 things. 1. Shannon and Canon are 2 people. 2. The final red statement of the 6th game cannot refer to there originally having been 16 people, which with the addition of Erica would come to 17 people, because Shannon and Canon already are 2 people on the island, not 1. So in conclusion, because of these red statements, it is established that Shannon and Canon are both 2 people and 2 persons, for which the same kanji is used in Japanese by the way, which means that they have separate bodies. In other words, Shannon and Canon are 2 separate individual human beings. Of course, some people will still try to wiggle their way out of this, but even if people could refer to personalities, that would still falsify the Shannon theory. First of all, it goes against the definition of people given in the 6th novel. In other words, saying that people can refer to personalities is nothing more than your own arbitrary opinion. There is no evidence for such an interpretation, and there is evidence against it. After all, if Shannon and Canon are both personalities of Yasu, then we are not dealing with merely 2 personalities to begin with, but at least 3. Namely, you have Yasu herself, her Shannon personality, and her Canon personality, and one could even argue that you would have to include her Beatrice personality as well, so that would make 3 if not 4 personalities. rather than 2. But even if there would be just 2 personalities to Yasu, then the "there are 17 people" statements actually disproves the canon theory, because it shows that there are 17 personalities in the island, even when Erica is included. So it doesn't really matter whether the word people refers to either bodies, as in the red in the 6th game confirms, or to personalities, which the canon believers simply made up. In either case, there is a conflicting red statement. If people means bodies, then the canon theory is wrong. If people means personalities, then the canon theory is wrong. And this becomes even more apparent when you consider that most believers in the official explanation believe that Yasu can let her personalities die without her body dying. For example, in the 2nd game, there is the red statement that Cannon was killed in Jessica's room. And in the 3rd game, Shannon and Cannon are both confirmed dead in the first Twilight. So what many believers in the official explanation believe is that Yasu can kill her own personalities, meaning that Shannon and Cannon can die without Yasu dying. But if you take that to the logical conclusions, when you assume that the word people can actually refer to personalities, then the following would have to be true. Namely that Yasu herself doesn't fall in the category of people. In other words, let's say that everyone apart from Yasu dies, and Yasu then also kills her Shannon and Cannon personality. Then that would mean that even though Yasu still exists on the island, it could be stated in red that there are no people on the island. Now would that make any sense at all? It doesn't matter how you take it. People is defined as living human bodies, not personalities. So even if you want to claim that it refers to personalities, you are simply making that up without evidence. But even if you do that, then you still run into fatal problems, since Yasu would have more than 2 personalities and would still be a person even if she never made up her Shannon and Cannon personality. So at the very least she would have 3 personalities, and arguably 4. So the red causes an unsolvable dilemma for the canon believers. No matter which definition you choose, it still disproves the canon theory. You can't even claim that Cannon was a real-life individual, but who got killed before the starting point of all games, and that Shannon simply disguised herself as Cannon. After all, there are several red statements that prevent that possibility. The only one who can claim Cannon's name is the person himself. A different person cannot claim his name. They definitely would not mistake any different person for Cannon. Cannon is dead. Among the 5 people in Kiria's group, he was the first to die. In short, he was the 9th victim. There simply is no way to get around it. Shannon and Cannon not only are not the same person, but they can't be the same person. They have to be separate individuals. The red truth, the highest authority in the story, testifies against the canon theory. Now I want to emphasize again that I don't for a second believe that Ryukishi made a mistake here. It's not the case that it was meant to be the truth behind the story that Shannon and Cannon are the same person. But he does try to deceive the readers into believing that. And he definitely succeeded, since so many people have fallen for this deception. But even if you cannot yet believe that he would try to deceive his readers into believing a false explanation, and would appeal to author's authority, and use quotes from interviews in which Ryukishi seems to confirm the canon theory, that still wouldn't do you any good. After all, even the designer of a game needs to play by his own rules. So the author can say what he wants, it doesn't change the fact that his own rules disprove the canon theory. Therefore we are forced to conclude that he either screwed up his own story, or the canon theory was a deception from the start. And I think that you can all agree with me that it is extremely unlikely that the author simply made a mistake. Now actually, this by itself would be enough to disprove the canon theory, but I think there are even more reasons to reject it. Moreover, the canon theory is not even necessary to explain all of the supposed pieces of evidence that supposedly speak in favor of it, in the first place. But if the canon theory isn't true, then what is the "even if you do join us, there are 17 people" line about? If Shannon and Cannon are separate individuals, then why are there only 17 people even if Erica joins them? But before I explain that, I will first move on to the solution of the logic error, because this is basically seen as the main piece of evidence for the canon theory. I have seen people write that the canon theory shouldn't even be up for discussion, since it's the only conceivable solution to the logic error of the 6th game. So is that true, or is there in fact an alternative solution to the logic error? Since it is my position that the canon theory is a purposeful deception on the author's part, I also believe the logic error solution of the 6th game is specifically designed for that purpose, since it so heavily seems to imply that Shannon and Cannon are the same individual. After all, Cannon disappears from a perfectly sealed room when the only room that potentially had its seals broken was the room where Shannon was in. And then later he disappears again from a room that is locked with a chain that cannot be set from the outside. But if the Cannon theory is indeed false, as I think I have already demonstrated by now, then is there even a possible solution left to this mystery? As I said, this is essentially the main piece of evidence for the Cannon theory. Nevertheless, I can solve the logic error without Shannon and Cannon being the same person. The reason Rikushi succeeded in fooling so many readers in believing the Cannon theory is basically because he showed the scene in which Erika seals the two rooms in a very specific way. If done in any other way, the deception would probably not have worked out and many people would have come to different conclusions. Let's watch the scene in which the two rooms get sealed, and let's see if you can figure out the real solution if I tell you to pay attention to 3 things. When watching this scene, I want you to answer these 3 questions. 1. What is Erika's location during this scene? 2. Who seals the rooms and by what method? And I'm talking here about the perspective of the viewer. And 3. What is the order of events? And I will give you one final hint for solving this mystery. In theory, anyone in the cousin's room could have rescued Battler, not just Cannon. Here is the scene in question. Could you figure it out? Did you see how Ryukishi succeeded in his deception? Let's answer the 3 questions I told you to pay attention to. 1. Where is Erika located? Erika is located in the hallway outside of the cousin's room and the next room over. Now this may not seem significant, but it is actually one of the 3 keys we need to unlock this closed room mystery. So we have Erika outside the doors of the rooms with the windows located on the opposite side. 2. Who sealed the rooms and by what method? As you could see, the viewer sees this scene from the meta-world perspective. And it is Glenor, Cornelia and Gertrude who use magic to instantaneously seal both rooms. But that's merely the viewer's perspective. This is not what could have happened in the real world. In the real world, Erika would have needed to seal the rooms herself by means of manually applying the tape to the doors, and then she needed to go around and apply it to the windows as well. This is the second key. And the third question, what was the order of events? The order of events is as follows. First, Erika checks everyone's location, then she seals the rooms. If the order had been the other way around, it would indeed have been impossible for Canon to escape the cousin's room. But this is the final key to unlock this mystery, namely the factor of time. So here's my blue truth. Canon escaped out of the window of the cousin's room when Erika was busy sealing the doors of the 2 rooms. When she got around to sealing the windows as well, Canon was no longer present inside the cousin's room. Since Erika checked everyone's location beforehand, she simply assumed that Canon would still have been present inside the cousin's room when she sealed the windows. But at the time she was sealing the windows, Canon had already escaped. Now a possible objection may be, where did I get that third room from that I'm depicting here in this slide? The point is that Erika required a way to reach the windows of the 2 rooms in order to seal those. And in the 5th game we are told that Erika sealed the windows of the guest house by scaling the wall. So she would have to go out of the window of another room in order to reach the windows of the room she was going to seal. Whether that room she left through was located next to the cousin's room is not important. It could have been any of the rooms inside the guest house. The exact method is not really important. The only point is that she had to go around in order to seal the windows of the 2 rooms. Another possible objection could be, wouldn't Erika have noticed that Canon was gone when she was sealing the windows of the cousin's room? But you have to remember here that Erika did not have the detective's authority, and she probably wouldn't have sealed the windows in full view of everyone as she was doing it in secret. In fact, I think we have a pretty good hint that this is what must have happened, and that is the appearance of the ladder outside of the guest house. When Erika was done sealing the rooms, she went out of the front door and found a ladder there informing her that Battle's corpse had vanished from the guest room in the mansion where he supposedly was killed. The only person who could have placed the ladder there would have to be Canon, but that means that he had to have been outside of the guest house just moments after Erika was done applying the seals. So in short, Erika checked everyone's location and then started applying the seals to the doors. In the meantime, Canon escaped through the window. Erika probably didn't went outside using the front door, but used one of the windows in one of the other rooms to scale the wall of the guest house to apply the seals to the windows of the cousin's room and the next room over. By that time, Canon had placed the ladder on the doorstep of the guest house. When Erika finished applying the seals to the windows, she went back inside again and went out of the front door. There she found the ladder that Canon had just placed there moments earlier, and Canon was now hiding somewhere outside. So the whole issue of the possibility of the seals on the windows of the next room over having been broken during the time of the logic error is a complete red herring, which was put in there to allow for the Canon theory deception. Canon actually escaped from the cousin's room in between the time it took for Erika to seal the doors and move to the windows. And not because he is Shannon in disguise, who escaped from the next room over and then appeared as Canon. So that takes care of Canon's escape from the cousin's room. However, the same trick cannot be used to explain Canon's disappearance from the guest room. After all, it was impossible for Canon to escape in the first place, since the red proves that only Battler left the guest room after he, Erika and Canon had entered it. In other words, Canon literally had to stop existing in the guest room. The official explanation would be something like this. Canon changed back into her Shannon outfit, so therefore no longer existed inside the guest room, since it was now Shannon hiding inside the closet instead of Canon. Or another way of putting it would be that Shannon killed her Canon personality while in the closet, whatever that is supposed to mean in the first place. but something incoherent along these lines would be what the believers in the Shannon theory would believe. However, this was never a good explanation to begin with. After all, why on earth would Shannon first change into her Canon outfit, either in the next room over in front of George or outside in the middle of a typhoon, and then change back again when she was inside the closet? So Canon rescuing Battler, if he is the same person as Shannon, makes absolutely no sense from the island perspective. So is there an alternative solution that would fit actually a lot better given what was really going on inside that room? Namely that a deranged killer who had just decapitated 5 people was now looking for Battler, whom she knew to be still alive somewhere inside that gas room. At least she thought she knew that because the chain was still set. Actually the answer is extremely simple. Here's my blue truth. Canon died inside the closet of the gas room. This is something that has been a rule throughout the entire story. Saying person X exists on location X requires that person to be alive unless it is specified that it's a corpse. After all, the reason Kinzo isn't counted among the list of people who exist on the island is because he is already dead, even though his corpse is in fact present on the island. That's how Erika is able to corner Natsui regarding the location of Kinzo in the 5th game. Because Kinzo is dead, he is not considered to exist anywhere on the island. So she can name any location and say in red that Kinzo doesn't exist there. Another example is in the 2nd game when they find Jessica's corpse in her room. Beatrice states in red who exactly is present inside that room. Jessica is not included in that list, so she then specifies Jessica as a corpse in order to add her to that list of people. In other words, that these people and the corpse of Jessica are present inside this room. And when Erika asked for the locations of everyone before she sealed the 2 rooms, she specified that it was regarding the locations of everyone's body so that the victims of the first Twilight could also be included. This means that if Canon was killed inside the gas room, then he would no longer be considered present inside the gas room, and therefore Beatrice could say in red, Canon does not exist in the guest room. Of course, this includes all parts of the closet, the bedroom and the bathroom. But how did Canon actually die inside the closet? That seems kind of random. But the answer is extremely simple. In the meta world, the fight with the red and blue statements is represented with guns which use either blue or red bullets. When Erika states in blue that Canon is hiding inside the closet, she shoots through the door of the closet and then we see Canon disappear. But when we think about what was happening on the island, the gun easily becomes a real gun. After all, Erika had just killed 5 people and decapitated them afterwards, so she probably had got her hands on one of the guns. Island Erika was actually planning on killing Battler, so she was looking for him in the guest room. Battler had hidden himself in the closet, however, and had set a trap in the bathroom. When Erika was dealing with the trap in the bathroom, Canon and Battler switched places and Canon set the chain before he went into the closet. When Erika came back out of the bathroom, she noticed that the chain was still set, meaning that Battler could not have left the room and that he had to have been hiding inside the closet. Erika then shot right through the door of the closet like she did from the Metaworld perspective and killed Canon in the process. But why did any of this happen in the first place? Well, let's tie everything that happened on the island during the 6th game together into a logical and coherent story. So here's a summary of what we already knew about what was going on, put together with my theory. A deranged obsessive girl washed up on Rokkinjima after falling from a ship. She was welcomed as a guest by the Ushiomir family. Due to her obsessive detective stories and claiming to have such a knack for solving mysteries, Battler gets the family to join in on pulling a prank on her. He, Kirie, Eva, Natsui, Rosa and Maria participate in setting up closed rooms for themselves and then play dead. Kraus, Rudolf, Hideyoshi and Goda cut the chains to all the rooms and pretend to find those 6 as being corpses in order to fool Erika into believing a murder occurred. Then Erika decides to put everyone into 2 rooms to keep each other under surveillance. They all play along since this was basically part of the plan, as the next step was to make Battler's corpse disappear, for which the ladder was arranged. As we learned in the 5th game, the wall between the cousin's room and the next room over is very thin, so if you keep your ear pressed against it you can hear what's going on in the next room. After all, they needed to monitor what Erika was doing. When they heard Erika leave the next room over, Canon quickly escaped out of the window so he could place the ladder on the doorstep of the guest house as part of the game. However, what none of them realized is that Erika is completely insane. Since she couldn't be sure that the 6 victims truly were dead, and since she now could move freely throughout the mansion, she took one of Kinzo's guns and shot all of the people playing dead, apart from Battler, and decapitated all of them. That way she could be sure that all of them were dead. She did notice, however, that they had been playing dead. So she realized that this was all a game set up by Battler as a battle of wits to outsmart the arrogant Erica. So she went to the room where Battler was to kill him. Battler had been hiding inside the closet and set up the hot water trap inside the bathroom section of the guest room. However, Cannon, who was in the mansion by now, noticed that all the people who were playing dead now really were dead. Realizing that Battler was now being hunted down by a deranged killer, he went over to the guest room to get Battler out of there. So when Erica was dealing with the trap in the bathroom, Cannon got Battler out of the room and then he set the chain back. After all, if he didn't, then Erica would realize that Battler had escaped and would have gone after him. By setting the chain, Cannon gave the impression that Battler was still hiding somewhere inside the room. When Erica saw that the chain was still set, she realized that Battler must be hiding inside the closet. Not allowing any chance for a surprise attack, Erica shot right through the door, unknowingly killing Cannon, who had taken Battler's place. So this way the entire 6th game can be explained without the Shikanon theory. In fact, I think that my explanation makes a heck of a lot more sense than the Shikanon explanation. So therefore, the logic error is not evidence for the Shikanon theory, and due to several read statements it has already been demonstrated that Shannon and Cannon are not the same person anyway, and neither are they required to be the same person in order to explain the 6th game. But now there is still the issue of the "even if you do join us there are 17 people" line. So what does this line refer to if Shannon and Cannon are separate individuals? First of all, this could never have supported the notion that there were originally 16 people without Erica in the first place. After all, if that was true, then it would have been impossible for Erica to say in red that she is the 18th human on Rokkinjima. Let's take a careful look at what she actually says. "Hi, pleased to meet you. I am Furudo Erica, the detective. I may be an uninvited guest, but please welcome me. I am the visitor, the 18th human on Rokkinjima." To which Battler responds, "Sorry, but even if you do join us, there are 17 people." Obviously, right after the logic error, this is a great addition for the Shikanon deception, since it seems to imply that there would have been 16 people without Erica. But if you consider that Erica states in red that she's the 18th human, this explanation is necessarily false. Now there are two things that need to be accounted for when interpreting the "even if you do join us there are 17 people" line. 1. Why is Erica's red in the form of an introduction? And 2. The fact that Battler's red is used to kill Erica. I believe that this is not a denial of either Shannon or Cannon as a person, but a denial of Erica. So here's my blue truth. Shortly after Erica Furudo washed up on Rokkinjima, she died. Therefore neither the 5th nor the 6th game can be the truth regarding the real 2 days of the Rokkinjima murders. Now this is probably extremely confusing, so let me explain. In order to do that, I will need to explain a technical logic term, namely the term counterfactual. You may have never heard of that term, so it may seem like I'm adding something to the story here, but I'm not. Even though the term doesn't occur in the story, the concept is necessarily part of the story. So what is a counterfactual then? A counterfactual is basically something that would be true if something else would be true that happens to be false in reality. In other words, you could phrase it like this. 1. If A, then B. 2. Not A. 3. Therefore not B. B is the counterfactual here. It is something that would be factual if A also would have been factual. For example, 1. If I eat, I am full. 2. I don't eat. 3. Therefore I am not full. Let's see this in terms of 2 possible timelines, one in which I eat and one in which I don't eat. So in the timeline in which I eat, I am full, but in the timeline in which I don't eat, I am not full. In other words, truth number 1 is conditional on timeline A being the true timeline. If timeline B is the true timeline, however, then truth number 1 is not applicable to actual reality. Number 1 would be true if timeline A was the real timeline. But if it can be denied that timeline A is what really happened, then number 1 is no longer applicable. So let's translate this to the Umineko story and use Eva as an example in the 2nd and 3rd game. After all, if Angie's perspective is the truth, meaning that Eva survived, then it would be impossible for a game in which Eva died to have been the truth regarding what really happened on Rokkinjima. Basically all games in Umineko are possible timelines, but only one of them could be the truth. If you believe that Angie's perspective is reality, then all games in which Eva died are counterfactuals. So let's say that the 3rd game was the truth. Then game 2 is merely a counterfactual, It would have been true if the culprit decided to act out the murders the way we read in the second novel, meaning that Eva would have been killed in the chapel. But let's say that it would have been stated in red that Eva survived. If that would have happened, then that red statement would have falsified all games in which Eva died. And I believe that this is exactly what the "even if you do join us there are 17 people" statement is about. I believe that Battler's Red has everything to do with counterfactuals. In other words, it's a denial of the games in which Erica existed as candidates for the real 2 days. Now this may not seem that obvious at all, since it's still the case that Erica says in red that she is the 18th human on Rokingima. But if becoming the 18th human on Rokingima resulted in her death by dying on the shores of the island, then it becomes apparent why she couldn't appear in any other games. In other words, if Erica would have survived long enough to be welcomed as a guest after she washed up on Rokingima, then either the 5th or the 6th game would have occurred. But in reality, she is the 18th human on the island, but she died before the family even noticed that someone had washed up on the beach. Therefore there are only 17 people, because the 18th one is already dead and therefore plays no role in any of the other games, and specifically not in a game that presents the truth about what really happened on the island. So that's how Meta Battler kills Meta Erica. That's how both their red statements can be stated in red, yet Erica is the one who loses. That's why Erica's red statement is in the form of an introduction. She asks to be welcomed as the 18th person, but Battler says that even if she would join the group, there still would be 17 people, because Erica died before she could join the family. In the meta world, this is represented by Battler using the red truth to shoot and kill Erica. In other words, the 5th and 6th games are counterfactuals in which Erica does survive long enough to join the family on the island, but Battler's final red disproves the possible reality of the 5th and 6th games, which puts an end to Erica. After all, why would Erica use a welcoming statement as her final defense? This would make sense given this explanation. So the final red is about Erica, not about Shannon and Cannon. So that takes care of the logic error and Battler's final red statement. I will now address the other pieces of supposed evidence for the Shannon theory. The claim here is that Shannon and Cannon never appear in front of Battler at the same time. The only time we see them together is from a subjective perspective and not from the objective perspective of Island Battler. They do both appear together in front of Battler during the 5th game, but during that game Erica is the one with the objective perspective instead of Battler, as she now holds the position of the detective. However, this is not really an argument in favor of the Shannon theory, but merely an argument from silence. In and of itself, it merely allows for the Shannon theory, but doesn't prove it in any way. But even so, it doesn't matter that they never appear in front of Battler at the same time. The issue is not in front of whom they appear, but whether or not they appear at the same time from an objective perspective. And they do appear at the same time in front of Erica during the 5th game. In other words, there is objective evidence of Shannon and Cannon appearing together based on detective's authority, it just doesn't happen to be Battler's perspective. In other words, the 5th game actually falsifies the Shannon theory. So we could phrase it like this. If Shannon and Cannon appear together from any objective perspective, the Shannon theory is falsified. 2. Shannon and Cannon do appear together from an objective perspective, namely Erica's. 3. Therefore, the Shannon theory is falsified. Now there is another claim that is connected to the claim that Shannon and Cannon never appear together. And that's the claim that Cannon's corpse disappears in both the 2nd as in the 4th game. So if Shannon and Cannon are not the same person, why does this happen? Again, this is merely an argument from silence, it doesn't prove anything in and of itself. And it becomes an irrelevant issue if there are good explanations to account for the absence of Cannon's corpse in both games. I will talk more in detail about this in chapter 8 when explaining the murders of the first 4 games, but I will summarize the reasons for Cannon's disappearance for now. The reason his corpse is missing in the 4th game is simply because his body is at the bottom of the well where Battler couldn't find it. The reason his corpse disappears in the 2nd game is because his body was hidden away by the culprit in order to set up the Cannon appearing as a demon scenario. But I think that the argument that Shannon and Cannon never appear in front of Battler actually backfires in yet another way, because the Shannon theory was inherently implausible to begin with. And that's for the simple fact that the Shannon theory would entail that all of the family members are unimaginably stupid. I mean, Jessica is in love with Cannon and is best friends with Shannon, whom she has known for most of her life. Shannon has been her servant for 10 years and Cannon for 3 years, and she never ever noticed that they were the same person? George may not live at the mansion, but even he would have to be the dumbest moron in the world for not noticing. Or what about Natsui and Kraus, who are her employers? They never noticed that the new servant boy was actually their servant girl who had worked there for 7 years? Of course, not to mention that if Shannon is also Yasu, then her Shannon outfit is a disguise as well, meaning that her original looks were that of Yasu, who began dressing up as Shannon and eventually began to use that character permanently. But I come back to that in the next couple of chapters. Kaede has been working in the mansion for 2 years, and he's not even in on anything regarding Kinzo's death, or anything at all for that matter. He also never noticed that 2 of the servants he was working with were actually one person for 2 years. And even if you suggest that, for example, Natsui knew about all of this, you still run into problems. After all, if Shannon's corpse wasn't present in the gardening set in the first game, and Cannon was standing there with Hideyoshi pretending that Shannon was lying there with half a face, even though she was standing there as Cannon, then you have to take into account that Natsui was standing in front of the shed as well. So either she didn't know about Shannon and Cannon and is therefore unreasonably stupid, or she did know, and then you have the problem that she would know that Hideyoshi and Cannon were lying. Of course you could claim that Natsui is an accomplice in the first game, but you would have to be pretty desperate to believe that Natsui could be an accomplice if her own husband is lying there in front of her with his face torn apart. Also, it's completely unnecessary to invoke Natsui as an accomplice, even from the perspective of the official explanation. In an interview, the author says that in the scene where Battle tries to touch Shannon's breasts, that if he would have touched them, he would have realized that they were fake. After all, it is unknown what Yasu's gender is, but even if she's a girl, the Shannon outfit includes the large breasts apparently. This is an example of Ryukishi being deceitful, and pretty transparently if you ask me. After all, even though George and Shannon haven't been intimate, George has in fact touched Shannon's breast accidentally. So if Battler would have realized that they were fake, then why wouldn't George have realized that as well? Again, this is another example of people being unreasonably stupid in order for the Shikanon theory to work. I simply don't buy any of this at all. I see no reason to believe that Shannon is wearing any form of disguise in the first place. I can basically be short about this statement because it is irrelevant. This statement is made in Barncastle's game that is based on different rules. For example, all windows of the mansion have bars in front of them, there are no keys but the 5 master keys, the culprits are different. Basically, this game stands on its own and is really nothing more than an actual game and a representation of what certain people believed in the future about who was behind the murders. Moreover, it's not even a red statement. The red merely says that in this game, when Shannon was killed, Cannon was treated as being killed and his master key destroyed. I see it as nothing more than a cunningly placed reference to get people who either have already fallen for the Shikanon deception or people who just weren't sure yet to believe. To me, it is in fact a confirmation that Ryukishi is toying with his readers. In the 6th novel there is the whole issue of the incompleteness of souls and the fact that only one of the couples can experience love. I'm talking here about Shannon and George, Cannon and Jessica, and Beatrice and Battler. According to the official explanation, Beatrice, Shannon and Cannon are all the same person, so it's obvious why eventually only one of them can be with their significant other. But if at the very least Shannon and Cannon are separate people, then what is this whole furniture love battle really about? However, I will not yet explain this at this point in the video, because I first need to get the nature of Yasu and Beatrice clear. So I will come back to this issue in a later chapter. Also, for the moment it is not relevant anyway, since it cannot save the Shikanon theory. Given all the evidence against the Shikanon theory, a different interpretation of the furniture's love battle is already necessitated. But for now I will give you a little hint. If my explanation of the logic error is correct, then Cannon is dead, so he cannot be with Jessica. Shannon won, because she and George are still alive. So since Beatrice also lost, and moreover lost before Cannon, then what is a reasonable conclusion about the person who Beatrice represents? I'll let you think about that for the next couple of chapters. Okay, so now apart from the furniture's love battle, I have accounted for all the supposed evidence in favor of the Shikanon theory without it, and have presented, in my opinion, lethal evidence against the Shikanon theory. So not only is the Shikanon theory essentially impossible, but it's not even required for Shannon and Cannon to be the same person in order to explain, well, basically anything in the story. In fact, as soon as you let go of this absurd notion that they are the same person in 2 disguises, things actually start to make a lot more sense. But what about the Yasu and Beatrice persona? Even though Shannon and Canon aren't the same person, you could still claim that Shannon and Yasu and Beatrice are the same person. Of course, you would have to believe that Yasu even exists as a real human being in order to believe that. But I think that the best evidence we have available suggests a very different perspective on the Yasu character in the 7th novel. The following 3 chapters will for the most part deal with the 7th novel, and this chapter with the Yasu character specifically. When it comes to believers in the official explanation, the 7th novel is basically taken in a very straightforward way, pretty much as a confession by the culprit in which the only possible explanation seems to be that Shannon is the true culprit of the story. However, what believers in the official explanation do not seem to appreciate is that the 7th novel demonstrably cannot be taken in a straightforward way, where the meaning is found on the surface of the story. In fact, the 7th novel is the most difficult novel of all and is a puzzle that needs to be pieced together, especially using knowledge we have gained from the previous 6 novels. Now why am I saying that? Well, basically because we are literally told that this is the case. Here are some things that you need to take into account when interpreting the 7th novel. The 7th novel was written in such a way that its meaning would be obscured. We are literally told by Bernkastel that this is the case in the 8th novel, as you can see in this screenshot. Now I want you to think very carefully about this. Would anyone reading the 7th novel not come to the conclusion that Shannon is supposed to be Yasu and Beatrice and therefore the culprit? Whether they would believe it or not is besides the point. I mean that they would at least get that implication. I think that even someone who hasn't read any of the novels and then would be presented with the 7th novel would understand what was implied by the 7th novel as long as they understood that it would be impossible for an extra added person to be the culprit. As long as that possibility is out of the question, the implication that Yasu and Shannon are the same person would be overly clear. So if it indeed is something that is so clearly on the surface of the 7th novel storyline, then why all the obscurity and even the specific mentioning that people who didn't already understand would not find the correct answers? After all, we even have Claire who is used to obscure Beatrice's identity, so that is yet another way that the truth is obscured. And given our experiences with the previous novels, we should be on our guard when things seem very clear, but when the writer goes to great lengths to be as vague as possible. And probably the most important aspect of this is the fact that the entire 7th novel is seen from a magical and fictional perspective with a fictional main character, namely Willard H. Wright, someone who clearly doesn't exist in reality. Later on, when Claire is introduced, Yasu's life story is depicted in a theater setting with actors playing certain roles. Another thing is that Yasu herself is never depicted. Basically, we see the beginning of Claire's story through Yasu's eyes in a first-person perspective, so we never even see what Yasu is supposed to look like. We should also take into account that it's a running theme that you are supposed to be able to figure out the motive without a confession from the culprit. After all, Erica says that this is a sign of a weak mystery novel. Now when it comes to Shannon's supposed motive, I would say that actually very little hints could be found in earlier novels, and those that were there are contradictory since they depend on the canon theory. But probably the most important thing is that a straightforward interpretation leads to many contradictions and results in an implausible, if not impossible, conclusion. And that's what I will first focus on. But before I continue, I will first explain what my position is regarding Yasu. I will defend this view in this chapter and the following 2 chapters collectively. First, I will list some things that I am denying. I am denying that Yasu is the baby who survived after falling down a cliff. That Yasu is an actual human being. That Yasu worked as a servant for the Uchiha family. That Yasu and Shannon are the same person. And that Leon's world is an actual possible timeline. These are the things that I am denying, and these are the things that I think there is actually no evidence for, or the evidence in favor of these things is in fact contradictory. The last thing on the list is what I want to make clear first. I am not merely denying the reality of Yasu, but also the reality of Leon. In other words, I see Leon as a fictional character as well, and I will come back to this in a minute. First I want to make clear what I do affirm regarding Yasu. I affirm that understanding Yasu is critical for understanding the culprit's motives. That Yasu, quote-unquote, transformed into Beatrice. That there is an important connection between Yasu and Leon. and that there is an important connection between Yasu and Shannon. So I will now summarize my view on Yasu and then defend it in this chapter and the next two chapters. My view on Yasu is the following. Yasu is a fictional or imaginary character. Yasu doesn't exist outside of the culprit's mind. The Yasu character went completely out of existence when she turned into Beatrice. Yasu is not literally the same person as the baby who fell down the cliff. The person who quote-unquote created Yasu is not the same person as the baby who fell down the cliff either. The baby who fell down the cliff lives on symbolically through Yasu, not literally. The person who created Yasu is probably not the biological daughter of the Kubedorian Beatrice. The person who created Yasu solved the epitaph and became the new family head. The person who created Yasu used Shannon to connect Yasu to the real world. The principle of it takes two to create a universe. The trigger for the Rokkinjima murders was Battler's sin against Shannon. The person who created Yasu carries the burden of Shannon's love for Battler and helped Shannon find new love in George. However, this does not mean that the person who created Yasu is in love with Battler. Her love for Battler is not a romantic type of love. Moreover, the person who created Yasu doesn't in the end act for Shannon's sake and in fact violently betrays her, which I'll come back to in chapter 5. The person who created Yasu is Rosa Ushiramiya. Yasu is a personification of Rosa's guilt for quote-unquote killing the Kubedorian Beatrice. This personification later quote-unquote becomes the new Beatrice. Shannon knows nothing about either Yasu or Beatrice until she meets Beatrice in October 1984 for the first time, which we see in the second novel. The times when Beatrice talks to Shannon before that, it is mentioned that her memories are erased. This symbolizes Rosa actually talking to Shannon, and therefore Shannon knows nothing about Beatrice yet, as she doesn't recognize Rosa as Beatrice yet. Now those are the most critical points of my fictional Yasu theory, although I also went into the Beatrice character already. The only thing that is missing of course is Rosa's motives, but that will be explained in chapter 4. So I will start at the beginning and explain first why I regard both Yasu and Leon as fictional characters. The first thing we need to look at is a problem that even believers in the official explanation have, and that is the fact that the Leon character is supposedly the same person as Yasu, but in the timeline in which she didn't fall down a cliff as a baby. However, no matter what your theory is about Yasu, you cannot accept that Yasu and Leon are literally the same person in different timelines. This is for two reasons. One, in Leon's timeline, she is an extra person on the island in which all other characters exist alongside of her in the same world. And two, Leon's world is essentially a magical world and therefore not real, not even a counterfactual. Even if you believe in the official explanation that Yasu is the same person as Shannon and Cannon, you still have to accept that in Leon's world, Shannon and Cannon exist as well. For example, when Will enters the chapel, Cannon is in front of the chapel and Leon is inside the chapel. We also see Will talking to Shannon and Leon at the same time as well. Moreover, neither Shannon nor Cannon should exist in Leon's world to begin with. After all, those personalities were supposedly the result of Yasu's experiences as a servant for the Ushiramiya family. But Leon and Yasu have led completely different lives. In other words, in Leon's world, the Shannon and Cannon personalities shouldn't exist since she wouldn't have developed those characters. So in summary, supposedly in Yasu's timeline, Shannon and Cannon are personalities that she developed later on. But in Leon's timeline, Shannon and Cannon are actual servants that exist alongside of Leon. So focusing on Shannon alone, since the Shikanon theory has been disproved already, Yasu and Shannon are supposedly the same person. But Leon and Shannon cannot be the same person. Basically, I could argue in the following way. 1. Yasu is Shannon, supposedly. 2. Leon is not Shannon. 3. Therefore, Yasu is not Leon. So even if you believe in the official explanation that Yasu is Shannon, then you cannot accept that Yasu is the same person as Leon. But not only is Leon not the same person as Yasu, her world is not even a real world to begin with. Which comes to the second point, Leon's world is essentially a magical world and therefore not real, not even a counterfactual. First of all, the whole notion of fragments is a magical explanation to begin with and should therefore be rejected. In Leon's world, the island is visited by a magical character, namely Willard H. Wright. Also, Kinzo is still alive, which shouldn't be the case either. Basically, Leon's world is nothing more than a storytelling device, regardless of whether you believe in the official explanation or not. It is not a representation of an actual possible timeline. So the Leon we know of and Yasu cannot be the same person in a literal sense, regardless of which explanation you believe. Leon's world is a fictional world even if the official explanation is true. So this by itself doesn't falsify the official explanation, of course, but it does show that neither the Leon character nor the Yasu character can be taken at face value. It means that both Leon and Yasu are open to interpretation, so it cannot be taken at face value that if the baby did not fall down the cliff, that she would turn out as the Leon we know of. By which I mean that if the baby would not have fallen down the cliff, that the exact timeline of Leon's world would be the result. After all, accepting that would falsify the official explanation, since you then also need to accept that this baby is an extra added character and not one of the other characters. In other words, when taken literally, the baby who Natsui rejected could possibly be either some version of Leon or Yasu, but not both. Now believers in the official explanation would probably say that the magical depiction of Leon indeed isn't literally true, but that this is merely a magical perspective representation of a timeline in which the baby was accepted by Natsui. However, they would actually be missing the bigger issue here, because I have no problem accepting the notion that Leon's world is a magical perspective representation of an alternate timeline. In fact, that is exactly what I believe, since it aligns with my theory. After all, I do believe that Leon, or in other words the baby, is an extra added character. The point is that it by no means is a red truth that Yasu and Leon are the same person. That is still an interpretation instead of an established fact. And since both believers in the official explanation and believers in an alternate explanation need to regard Leon's world in the context of a magical perspective, the connection between Leon and Yasu that is made within that world could also be seen as part of that magical perspective context. In other words, if Leon's world cannot be taken literally, it is possible to regard the connection between Leon and Yasu as non-literal as well. And that's the way I see Leon and Yasu. In my theory, these two are not literally the same person. But as I will explain later on, Yasu is how Leon symbolically lived on after she died by falling down a cliff. Well, it seems that Kinzo did want to call his child Leon, and Natsui did confirm that a baby was put into her care, who then fell down a cliff. So here's another blue truth. The baby who fell down the cliff was really the child of Kinzo and the Koridorian Beatrice. If the baby would have survived, he or she would have been called Leon and would have been an extra member of the family. This is no problem for my theory, since I do believe that the baby who fell down the cliff is an extra added person and not one of the other characters. And we also know that the culprit cannot be someone other than the 18 characters that we knew of since the beginning. And we already established that Leon and Yasu are not the same person in a literal sense. So that means that I believe Leon, the baby who fell down the cliff, died. This way everything adds up apart from the issue of Genji and Nanju supposedly having saved the baby after it survived the fall. If we take that away for a second, Leon's world makes sense as a magical depiction of a timeline that would have occurred if the baby had not fallen down the cliff. Because Leon truly is an extra character and not one of the other characters, especially not Shannon or Canon. So what I'm trying to say is that if the baby had not fallen down the cliff, then the result would be a world in which there would be an extra added family member, namely Leon. And that's what the world in which Willard H. Wright appears represents. However, this is seen from a magical perspective, so it has all kind of fictional elements to it, like Kinzo being alive and Willard appearing in the first place, since he's a magical character as well. Of course, as I mentioned, the immediate objection to this would be that Genji and Nanjo are said to have saved the baby after it fell down, but survived. But I'll come back to this in a minute. First I want to present some more arguments to demonstrate why Yasu pretty much has to be a fictional character. The first argument is actually the same as I made against the canon theory, namely that the family, especially Natsui, Kraus and Jessica, would have to be unimaginably stupid for not noticing that Yasu began dressing up as Shannon. You could of course claim that the name provided for Yasu was Shannon to begin with, but that doesn't account for the change in appearance. If Yasu is Shannon, she is wearing some form of disguise and later on even fake breasts, if we trust what the author said in the interview I quoted in the previous chapter. The second argument is that Yasu is never ever acknowledged to ever have existed by anyone at any moment outside of the 7th novel. Yasu is only present at the parts before she turns into Beatrice and absolutely nowhere else. Which goes into the third point. Yasu went completely out of existence and is never heard from again from the moment she turns into Beatrice. So I actually want to turn things around. Rather than me arguing against Yasu being real, I want to ask you the following question. Are there in fact any good reasons to believe that Yasu is real in the first place? After all, why should I shoulder all the burden of proof? We all have to acknowledge that there is at least evidence against Yasu being a real person. Now you could of course do all kinds of intellectual tap dancing to try to reconcile these discrepancies, but what reason is there to do such a thing in the absence of actual evidence in favor of Yasu being a real person? So I want to challenge believers in the official explanation and make them accountable for their own share in the burden of proof. Prove that Yasu is a real person. If you cannot show any actual evidence that suggests that Yasu has ever actually existed, then why would anyone even attempt to reconcile the evidence I showed against Yasu being real? Not that I think that you can actually reconcile these discrepancies without being extremely ad hoc. Basically, we only know that Natsui confirmed that the baby indeed was real. But I have already established a discrepancy between Yasu and the baby Leon being the same person. And I will present yet another argument in a minute. So all evidence for Yasu being real will have to come from the 7th novel itself. And it should already be clear that the 7th novel cannot be taken at face value to begin with. So again, what evidence is there that suggests that Yasu is a real person? Even if you do believe that Yasu is a real person, you would at least have to admit that she at least fits the profile of a fictional character. I don't think that that can be denied, regardless of what theory you believe in. And I highly doubt that any believer in the official explanation can show any actual evidence that suggests that Yasu ever existed. That the baby existed? Absolutely. But that Yasu existed? Absolutely not. There is no evidence in favor of that proposition, and there is evidence against it. So in the end, the only thing that really would suggest the reality of Yasu is Genji and Nanjo's confession that the baby survived, which then 9 years later was introduced as a servant. Which is a fictional setting in which neither Genji nor Nanjo are really truly present. You need to keep that in mind as well. But let's consider this issue of the baby surviving the fall for a moment. Is that really a plausible explanation of what happened? Nanjo said that even though the baby survived, it had terrible injuries. Which is no surprise of course. Just think about what the effects of such a fall would be on such a young child. Arms and legs broken, potential brain damage, massive blood loss. Basically, a child that would survive such a fall is to be suspected to be handicapped for life. Not to mention that the servant who was holding the baby died on impact. But somehow the baby did survive? Really? But is there any evidence that Shannon, who supposedly is Yasu, has any problems walking or any other long-lasting injuries or even scars for that matter? Or is even the Yasu character ever shown to have such injuries? The only type of long-lasting injuries are merely implied and in a very weak sense at best. Basically the only thing is this little scene. So here we see Yasu blaming Nanjo and Genji for saving her, which resulted in her having to live in a quote-unquote body incapable of love. Now let's consider how believers in the official explanation could interpret this scene. Obviously this cannot refer to some obvious handicap, since Shannon has been doing household work for almost her entire life, and has no problem using her arms or is shown to have any signs of brain damage or whatever. She might be a little clumsy and would be pretty much insane if the official explanation was true, but that is not direct evidence for brain damage or whatever kind of injury. So another approach could be to say that she has a lot of scars over her body. But then you have to claim that only her torso was damaged and that her legs and face and such are completely free of scars, which sounds a bit implausible to me. Yet another approach could be to say that Shannon is incapable of bearing children due to the fall. And it is essentially the official explanation that Yasu supposedly had problems on a sexual level, as Ryukishi explained in an interview, or as I believe lied about in an interview. Quote, Yasu said in episode 7 that she has a body that is unable to love. To which Ryukishi responds, if you take this expression as a basis, you can imagine her sad fate of having some kind of imperfection on a sexual level. I think it's possible to get to that point. At first I was thinking that it was maybe a terrible wound that chained Yasu to the bed, but that does not seem to be the case at all. It is a pretty adult topic, so I had to obscure its depiction. However, the official explanation itself gets kind of in the way here. After all, it's not even clear what Yasu and Leon's gender is to begin with, and coupled together with the Shikanon theory, Yasu is playing a male character as well. So if Yasu is actually a boy, then Shannon is not even a girl to start with. So bearing children would have been impossible to begin with. So you already need to accept that Yasu is a girl to go with this interpretation. However, Natsui would have been in the position to know what the gender of the baby was who fell down the cliff. And in the 5th novel she is confronted by the man from 19 years ago. So this suggests that the baby was probably a boy and not a girl. After all, if it had been a girl, then why would Natsui have thought that the guy on the phone was that baby from 19 years earlier? But even so, it's still far from obvious how a body incapable of love would solely refer to the inability to provide either George or Jessica with children. George is indeed shown to have a child wish, and this is what is referred to in the interview with Ryukishi, but there is never really any connection made between the two in the actual story. Also, you would need to assume that the only lasting effect of the fall would be something like an injured womb, and nothing else. Or in the case that you believe that Yasu was originally a boy, that he, well, I guess lost his genitals after the fall or something along those lines. In which case it has nothing to do with bearing children in the first place. So at the very least, the connection between Yasu and the baby falling down the cliff are questionable at best and downright incoherent at worst. I think that the whole issue of the baby and the issue of Nanjo and Genji having rescued it can be interpreted in a very different and arguably more consistent way. And I think that the key to unlock the meaning of forced to live in a body incapable of love is to understand the meaning of the term furniture. Yasu says that because Genji and Nanjo rescued her, she is forced to live in a body that is no better than furniture. This could indeed be interpreted as a handicapped body, but I don't think it means that at all. After all, not just Shannon and Canon use the term furniture to refer to themselves, but Genji does so as well. And given that I already proved that Shannon and Canon are not the same person, that means that we have two people other than Shannon who refer to themselves as furniture. So this makes it rather implausible that furniture indeed is a term that refers to a physical state of one's body. I believe that the term furniture has nothing to do with one's body, but with one's social status. The term furniture depicts the status of servants being part of the household as tools for the comfort and benefit of the family. It's a term referring to social ranking, not to a supposed handicapped body. So how does that tie into being forced to live in a body that's like furniture, a body incapable of love? I will explain this quote in full in chapter 5, but for now I will explain how all of this relates to Rosa in the first place. To understand that, let's do what we are told to do in the 7th novel, and that is not to ignore the heart. So let's try to understand the heart of a young girl who felt like a murderer for most of her life, who shouldered the burden of a terrible secret and who got away with it due to Genji's help. The girl I'm referring to is the young Rosa from 19 years ago. This is how I believed Yasu originated. In 1967, a young Rosa met Beatrice II at Coedorian and she persuaded her to leave the mansion, which resulted in her accidental death due to her falling down a cliff. But Rosa never saw this as a mere accident, however. In her mind, she killed Beatrice. That's how she always refers to this incident, that she killed Beatrice. Even though it really was an accident, that's simply not how Rosa perceives it. If you don't want to ignore the heart, then you certainly cannot ignore the heart of a young girl who felt guilty her entire life for the death of the Coeurdorian Beatrice. I really don't think that this issue can be overlooked, and it does get overlooked in the official explanation. Rosa is burdened with a tremendous amount of guilt, not only towards Beatrice herself, but how do you think it would affect her relationship with her father? However, Kinzo actually never finds out that Rosa was responsible for Beatrice's death. After all, in the 7th novel we learn that Rosa tells Genji about the incident, and he helped to cover it up so that Kinzo will never find out that Rosa even was present when Beatrice fell down the cliff. But despite, or perhaps even because of that, what do you think happened to Rosa's relationship to Kinzo? Remember that she sees herself as Beatrice's killer. Rosa had killed her father's one and only true love, yet her father didn't even know that she was involved. If she had been feeling so much guilt towards Beatrice herself, as she expressed clearly in both the 3rd novel and in the 7th novel, regarding a person who she doesn't even know, how much of a burden would her guilt towards her father have been? How could she ever make up for such a crime? And then, in a matter of months, a baby was put into Natsui's care. Leon, the child of Kinzo and the Coeurdorian Beatrice, who had given birth to it a short time before Rosa killed her. And as fate has it, this baby, Beatrice's child, also falls down a cliff and dies. Both mother and child have died because they fell down a cliff. Now I don't think this can be emphasized enough. Of all kinds of ways that people can die an accidental death, the baby dies by falling down a cliff, just like Beatrice II did, which was witnessed and in her mind also caused by Rosa. The death of the baby Leon occurred in the same year as the death of the Coeurdorian Beatrice, meaning that Rosa was the same age and therefore still living in the mansion when the baby fell to his death, since Rosa was still a child back then. For killing her father's true love and getting away with it, she probably would have felt very distant from her father, and that she couldn't possibly deserve any fatherly love from Kinzo. So in an emotional sense, by killing Beatrice, she would also have lost her father. And later on, her biological mother died as well. So even though she was not literally an orphan, it is not unlikely that she would have felt like one. Not only that, given how important honor and social status in the Ushimura family, and in Japanese culture in general, and the ultimate shame she has brought upon herself, she would not only see herself as an emotional orphan, but also as the lowest possible rank in the family hierarchy, which would be the status of the youngest servant. In other words, if Rosa's guilt would get personified in her head, then what could we expect such a personification to be like? It would be quite plausible that the result would be a young, inexperienced, unimportant servant who is also an orphan. And that's what I believe Yasu to be. Yasu is the personification of Rosa's guilt. Yasu living on as the baby who fell down the cliff, in a sort of similar way as Kinzo living on after Natsui and Kraus insisted on pretending that Kinzo was still alive even though he died from his disease. But just like Kinzo didn't literally live on, neither do I believe that the baby literally lived on. But an essential difference, however, is that the illusion of Kinzo was at least a representation of the original person. But in the case of Yasu, Yasu took Leon's place because of something that Genji did, which the person who Yasu represents interprets as being rescued by him, forcing her to quote-unquote create Yasu to bear her guilt because she never was forced to face the consequences for what happened to the Koedoi and Beatrice. However, another essential difference between Kinzo living on as an illusion and Leon living on as an illusion is that Kinzo's illusion was the result of multiple people presenting that illusion to the world. But in Yasu's case, I believe that this illusion only exists in the mind of a single person, namely the person who Yasu was created by. The other people on the island have no knowledge of Yasu whatsoever, nor have they even ever heard of her. So I believe Yasu to be a completely fictional character in a single person's mind who symbolically lives on as the baby who fell down the cliff, to be a replacement for Leon. If Leon hadn't died, then even though Yasu might still have come into being, she would not have served the role of being Leon's replacement. I will talk about the why done it concerning Rosa in chapter 4, but I will reveal her general motive in order to explain why Yasu serves as Leon's replacement, as the way Leon symbolically lives on through Yasu. And that's the following. Rosa is trying to revive the Koedoi Beatrice by becoming a new Beatrice herself. Creating Yasu was the first step in this process. Now one may wonder what Shannon has got to do with this in the first place. After all, if Yasu only exists in Rosa's mind, then what is the connection to Shannon? Well, as a general theme in the story, and in the 7th novel in particular, it takes two to create a universe. In order to quote-unquote create Yasu, Rosa would need some connection to the real world other than herself. She needs another person in order for Yasu to take shape. And that's Shannon's role. Yasu basically lives her life through Shannon, so to say, as Yasu isn't physically present on the island in the first place. Furthermore, even Rosa herself would have left the island probably after the first year after creating Yasu, because at that point in time Maria would have been born, meaning that Rosa probably would have gone to live on her own. In other words, Yasu's life takes shape through Rosa observing the servants, and especially later on when she leaves the mansion, through conversations Rosa has with Shannon, or sometimes together with Kumasawa and Shannon, especially when it concerns mystery novels. Shannon is essentially the medium through which Yasu's quote-unquote life can take shape. Now we know that Shannon began working at the mansion 10 years before the year of the murders, so it's quite safe to say that Rosa would still have been living at the mansion when Shannon began working there, and then suddenly left the mansion when she gave birth to Maria, or perhaps even stayed there for the first couple of years since her husband ran out on her before Maria was born. So I don't believe that Yasu's life took place in real time. In other words, it's not the case that when you read the bits about Yasu in the 7th novel, that you should think of that like seeing through Rosa's eyes. Obviously that's not the case. She really is depicted as an extra character, but not a real one. Moreover, even though she exists within Rosa's mind, she doesn't share Rosa's mind, if you know what I mean. Later, when Yasu turns into the first form of Beatrice, there are actually far fewer moments when there are conversations between her and Shannon. So that's the connection between Shannon and Yasu. However, Shannon herself doesn't know about this. That's why when Yasu eventually turns into the first form of the witch Beatrice, and therefore goes out of existence, Shannon never even appears to have any knowledge regarding Yasu. It is not just like Yasu was never there, she really was never there to begin with. So there you have it, that's my fictional Yasu theory. But this is still a job half done. After all, I haven't proven yet that Yasu is connected to Rosa. Also, I still need to connect Rosa to the rest of the 7th novel, namely how she relates to Battler's sin against Shannon. And there is still that thing about being furniture and having a body incapable of love. So how should I go about proving the connection between Yasu and Rosa? After all, there is so little that can be objectively established in the 7th novel. Well, the determining factor is going to be the answer to the following question. Who is the third Beatrice? If I can prove that Rosa is the Beatrice who carried out the murders on the island, the Beatrice who actually appeared on the island during the 2nd game and even appears to battle face to face during the 4th game, then I have established the connection between Rosa and Yasu, since Yasu is the one who turned into Beatrice. So in the next chapter I'm going to give over a dozen arguments to establish that Rosa is Beatrice. Moreover, I will also give arguments against Shannon being Beatrice. In the chapter after that I will talk about Rosa's motives and tie everything in the 7th novel together. I already made clear in my first Umineko Explained video that any theory needs to incorporate one of the people on the island as the island version of Beatrice who appeared in the second and fourth games. Especially the fourth, since that's the game in which this Beatrice appears in front of Battler and therefore is part of the objective perspective. I already gave some arguments in my original video for the theory that Rosa is this Beatrice in a fairly simple disguise, but the funny thing is that in the official explanation, the island version of Beatrice is not a disguise at all, but simply what Shannon truly looks like. It's the Shannon outfit that is a disguise after all. It is Yasu who supposedly is the daughter of Beatrice and therefore looks like her. So we have my theory that Rosa is Beatrice, and we have the official explanation that Shannon is Beatrice, and also canon Yasu and Leon. But which one is better supported by the actual evidence? I'm going to present a lot of argumentation in favor of Rosa being Beatrice, but let me first present arguments against Shannon being Beatrice. I have 4 general arguments against Shannon being Beatrice. 1. A conflicting red statement. Actually there are 2 conflicting red statements, but I'll leave the second one for the chapter on whistleblowing. 2. Maria's testimony, or what I would call the Gollum argument. 3. Shannon's tattoo. And 4. A general lack of evidence in favor of Shannon being Beatrice. Just like with the Shannon theory, I'm going straight for the jugular vein. Namely, is the Shannon is Beatrice theory in conflict with any red statement? And yes, there is in fact a major one. One thing that should be clear from the 7th novel is that the sin Battler committed, which led to the mass murder on the island, was the sin of forgetting the promise he made to Shannon. He promised Shannon, who was in love with Battler, to take her away from the island, but Shannon didn't realize that Battler wasn't being serious. In other words, the sin which the island version of Beatrice demanded Battler to remember in the 4th game was this sin, Battler's sin against Shannon. That means that we can turn these facts into a deductive argument. 1. If Shannon and Beatrice are the same person, then whatever Battler does against Shannon, he does against Beatrice. Or in other words, if A is B, whatever you do against A, you do against B. 2. Battler sinned against Shannon. Conclusion, therefore, Battler sinned against Beatrice. After all, they are the same person according to the official explanation. Battler sinned against Shannon, and that was her motive for carrying out the murders. However, that is in conflict with one of the red statements made regarding this sin, namely what Beatrice says to Battler during the 4th game. The sin I am now demanding that you remember is not between Ushira Battler and Beatrice. Due to this red statement, Shannon should automatically be crossed off the list of possible suspects for being Beatrice. Instead, we should come to the conclusion that the person who is Beatrice is acting out the murders indeed because of Battler's sin, but not because it's a sin against that person itself. In other words, that this person is carrying out the murders on Shannon's behalf or something along those lines. Now I'm not suggesting that you have to think about that in the sense of hiring an assassin to murder someone on your behalf. At least that's not my theory at all. But I will talk about how this sin between Battler and Shannon relates to Rosa in the next chapter. But when it comes to Shannon being Beatrice, one needs to use some really ad hoc reasoning to make this red statement compatible with Shannon being Beatrice. You would have to make the statement essentially meaningless in order to do that. For example, you could try to say that this statement means that Battler's sin is not against the fictional witch of Rokindjima, or that his sin is indeed against Shannon but not against her Beatrice personality. In which case one must wonder what this red statement exists for in the first place, and also how you could possibly know that such a distinction even can be made. Since I have no commitment towards the official explanation, I can simply take this red statement as it is and conclude that whoever Battler sinned against, that person is not the same person whom Beatrice represents. That would be the most logical and reasonable conclusion to draw from this red statement. At the very least, nobody can deny that. So in other words, you need to do some intellectual tap dancing to make this red statement fit in with the official explanation. But given my theory, I can simply take the red statement as it is and accept it as it is. But it's inevitable that believers in the official explanation will nevertheless try to reconcile this red statement with Shannon being Beatrice by using the examples I gave before or some other form of ad hoc reasoning. So let's address that approach a bit. I want to ask the people who think that this red statement could and should be reconciled with Shannon being Beatrice the following 2 questions. 1. What is your basis for doing this? And 2. Why would you want to do this? My point is it truly your position that there is no conflict with this red statement? Or Is it that you simply start with the official explanation as being true and then try to reconcile it with this red statement? In other words, that your approach is like this. The official explanation is true, therefore it must be compatible with this red statement. Which to me is just an excuse not to think. After all, you could resolve any apparent conflict if you just assume your explanation to be true as a starting point. After all, if you take this approach, then even if it was stated in red that Shannon is not the culprit or Shannon is not Beatrice can still be reconciled. It's just a matter of how creative you can be. For example, you could say that it is true that Shannon is not the culprit because it was her Beatrice persona that is the true culprit. Or if you would be confronted with the other one, instead you could say that it is true that Shannon and Beatrice aren't the same person because Beatrice isn't really a personality but more like a way Shannon acts. So that doesn't really make her Beatrice after all. You see where I'm going with this? If you start with the unshakable assumption that explanation X is true, then any possible conflict can be resolved no matter how far-fetched the resolution may be. For example, if your theory was that someone was hiding in scenario X and it was stated in red that no one was hiding, you could for example say that the culprit wasn't purposefully trying to stay out of sight. So technically he wasn't hiding. It just so happened that he wasn't seen by anyone. This way you can make almost any theory unfalsifiable. Therefore, some objective standard simply is required. So instead of dealing with all possible ways you could attempt to reconcile this red statement, let me ask you another question. Why would it not be okay to simply take this red statement as it is and conclude that therefore Shannon cannot be Beatrice? Why would that be a problem apart from the fact that it goes against the official explanation? Or to put it in another way, if it is the case that Battle's sin was not against the real person behind the Beatrice character, what would a red statement confirming that look like? Now I actually have another red statement against Shannon being Beatrice, and some of you may already have realized which one that would be. But I'm not going to present that one yet. I'm going to save that one for chapter 9 about hints within the story and within interviews with the author to support my theory that the official explanation is a deliberate deception on Ryukishi's part. Arguments based on red statements are of course always the strongest types of arguments, but apart from the red statement regarding Battle's sin, there is also circumstantial evidence against Shannon being Beatrice. An example of this would be Maria's testimony in the 7th novel, when Will is asking her about the first time she met Beatrice. Now the first thing that is interesting is the fact that Maria tells Will that she and Rosa visited the island outside of the annual family conferences, which by now should be obvious why that is important. But besides that, Maria tells Will that Beatrice not only appeared to her, but also to the servants and Dr. Nanjo. Will also discovered something that I argued for in my previous Umineko Explained video, and that is that Maria recognizes Beatrice not based on appearance, but based on behavior. In other words, it's how this person acts that makes Maria believe her to be Beatrice. And according to Maria, this person has also behaved that way in front of other people, namely Genji, Kumasawa, Dr. Nanjo, and Shannon and Cannon. But think about what that means. The person who represents Beatrice could never appear in front of that person itself. If Shannon is Beatrice, then Maria can see Shannon quote-unquote transform into Beatrice and vice versa, and Shannon could appear as Beatrice in front of other people. But Shannon could not appear as Beatrice in front of herself. The reason I call this the Gollum argument is because the only way you could reconcile this conflict is by appealing to a similar situation to Gollum's split personality in Lord of the Rings, in which his two sides are talking to each other using the same body. That's what believers in the official explanation would have to picture an encounter between Shannon as Beatrice and Shannon as herself to be like. And of course you would have to assume that all of this would still make sense to Maria. Now couple that together with the Shikanon theory and we have ourselves a really unbelievable and incoherent mess. I mean, could you even imagine what such a scenario would be like? Hey Maria, I'm the Golden Witch Beatrice. Oh, what amazing! Shannon, you need to see this! Oh, hello Beatrice, I am Shannon. Bow down to me, you furniture. Wow, I'm actually talking to a witch. Cannon must see this too. I'll go and get him. Wait a minute, wait. Almost there. There we are. I mean, are we seriously supposed to believe something like this? Or should we simply conclude that since Beatrice appeared in front of Nanjo and all the other servants with the exception of Goda, because Beatrice isn't a person among those people at all? Now tell me in all honesty, if we have the Gollum explanation on the one end and the Beatrice being someone else's explanation on the other end, which explanation is the most reasonable one? Again, I will say that the only reason one would be willing to stick to the official explanation here is because you take it as a starting point that the official explanation has to be true, and therefore anything should be adapted to fit that explanation, regardless of how silly it is. The next argument I want to make against Shannon being Beatrice is the discrepancy in the outward appearances of Shannon and the island version of Beatrice. As we know, both Shannon and Beatrice have a tattoo of the one-winged eagle on their leg. So that would exactly be evidence in favor of Shannon being Beatrice, right? Well, the problem is that the island version of Beatrice has the tattoo on her right leg, while Shannon has it on her left leg. This may seem like a trivial point, but there is more to it than may appear. Remember that the island version of Beatrice appears in front of Battler at the end of the 4th game. Now I suppose that the response to this would be that Battler might not have been able to see her tattoo since she was standing on the balcony. However, if believers in the official explanation will use that counter-argument against the discrepancy of the tattoo, then they have also provided me with a counter-argument to the claim that Rosa has brown eyes and brown hair even though Island Beatrice has blue eyes and blonde hair, even though in the anime version Rosa and Beatrice's hair are about the same, as well as their overall appearances being very similar in the anime version. And by the way, Shannon doesn't have blue eyes in the novels either. But eye color is very easy to disguise anyway, but changing the location of a tattoo is not. So yes, you could indeed suppose that the tattoo would not have been visible for Battler, in which case you would get around this argument. But then you should wonder why the tattoo is there at all. If Beatrice is supposed to be Shannon, then why is the tattoo not on her left leg? Of course, you could argue that placing it on her left leg would make it perhaps too obvious that it is Shannon. But then why did Ryukishi not place Island Beatrice's tattoo on a different part of her body, which on the other women is covered up at all times, like her upper right arm or something? In other words, why does this discrepancy exist when it didn't need to exist in the first place? Or should we again conclude that Shannon is not Beatrice instead of trying to find some way to make it compatible anyway? Now you will probably say, but how do we know that Rosa has a tattoo of the family crest on her right leg? And that's a fair question. We indeed don't know that, but there are two things to consider here. One, at least there is no conflict between Beatrice's tattoo and Rosa, since we can neither confirm nor disconfirm her having the family crest on her right leg. And two, there is at least an indication that Rosa may have the family crest tattooed on her body somewhere. After all, we know that Eva has the family crest tattooed on her right arm in addition to having it on her clothes. So it is at least not unlikely that all of the family members, or at least the siblings, have the family crest somewhere on their bodies as well as on their clothes. This of course doesn't prove in any way that Rosa has the family crest on her right leg, only that it is certainly possible. In other words, with Shannon as Beatrice we have a conflict regarding this tattoo, but with Rosa we do not have such a conflict. Of course, another way believers in the official explanation could get around this is by saying that it's not a tattoo in the first place, but rather some other form of marking that can easily be removed and reapplied. But however you take it, at the very least this argument does remove any objection towards Rosa being Beatrice based on appearance. So now let's move from arguments against Shannon being Beatrice to arguments in favor of Rosa being Beatrice. I will begin with what I consider to be one of the best arguments for Rosa being Beatrice, because it ties so much of the story together. It's about Eva's role in the third game and how it was possible for Eva to escape the explosion by escaping to Kaede-Caio, and especially how this relates to the future perspective of Angie and the fact that Eva's diary has the truth written within it, meaning that we must account for Eva having discovered the truth. When it comes to making the connection to Angie's perspective and Eva's diary, I do have to assume that Angie's perspective resulted from the third game. In other words, that the timeline of the third game is the same timeline as Angie's perspective. Now not everyone would be willing to accept this. However, there are basically only three options available to account for Angie's world. 1. It resulted from the third game. 2. It resulted from the seventh game. Or 3. It resulted from an unknown game. Now many people seem to believe that Angie's world is the real world resulting after the real 2 days of the murders on Rikkinjima. I definitely do not share that belief. However, whether Angie's world is the real world or a counterfactual timeline is in the end not really relevant for my argument. The issue is which theory can actually account for Eva being alive in Angie's world, and especially Eva knowing the truth. Now you could assume that Angie's world resulted from the 7th game, but I don't think many people really believe that. Also, I think you run into some problems then, which I will explain near the end of the video. So you could go for the 3rd option, but in that case absolutely nothing gets explained. It means that we don't know why Eva is alive in Angie's perspective, and we also don't know how Eva knew the truth, and it basically is just anybody's guess. However, if the 3rd game is what preceded Angie's world, then my theory can in fact account for Eva's escape to Kaede-Caio and how she came to know the truth. Let's first establish what we know about Angie's world in relation to the island. The bomb destroyed the mansion and its surroundings. Eva survived by escaping to Kaede-Caio. And here's my blue truth: she could not have escaped through the forest at night in the middle of a typhoon in a short period of time. And another blue truth: she could only have escaped by using the secret tunnel in the underground VIP room. That's the place where the gold is. The trigger to the bomb is located in the underground VIP room, namely the clock. So therefore I conclude, someone without knowledge of both the bomb and the tunnel would not discover either of them without being told about it. And since Eva escaped, she had to have known about both the bomb and the secret tunnel. So then the issue becomes, when did Eva learn about this? So my blue truth is, Eva learned about all of this when she discovered the gold. Just like when in the 7th game the siblings discover the gold, Beatrice reveals the truth to them. When Eva discovered the gold, all of the servants were already dead. Because of the red statement, 6 people, which we already established meaning 6 bodies, Kinzo, Genji, Shannon, Kanon, Goda and Kumasawa are dead. So that means that in the first scenario of the 3rd game there were 6 dead bodies. And those bodies were identified as Kinzo, Genji, Shannon, Kanon, Goda and Kumasawa. So it's absolutely impossible that any of them could be alive. In other words, this includes Shannon, so if she was Beatrice, she would not have been able to confront Eva in the underground VIP room. And my final blue truth: there is absolutely no evidence that Eva had been told about the bomb and the tunnel before she discovered the gold. Before Eva escaped from the island, she learned the truth, which she wrote in her diary. This is the book of the single truth in Angie's world. We know with red certainty that Eva's diary contains the real truth about what happened on the island. We know that Eva has been keeping the truth a secret for her entire life, even on her deathbed. Even though many people believed her to be the real murderer, she'd rather had them believe that than to reveal the real truth. In other words, Eva was willing to protect the truth until the very end. So we must wonder, why is that? So how, given the official explanation, would it be possible to both explain the 3rd game and Angie's future perspective collectively? Whoever is the culprit in the 3rd game, it first of all cannot be Shannon, or Kanon for that matter, since the red statement confirming the deaths of the servants and Kinzo specifically states that the 6 people are dead, meaning 6 dead human bodies, in which the names refer to the identities of those bodies. So there's no room for wordplay regarding names or quote-unquote character death or personality death or whatever it may be. So if Shannon truly is Beatrice, then Beatrice died in the 6-linked closed room chain regardless of whoever set up that scenario for whatever reason. That means that when Eva discovered the gold, it would be impossible for Beatrice to confront her there and explain everything in a similar way as in the 7th game, meaning that Eva would just have found a room full of gold without any knowledge regarding the bomb or the secret tunnel to Kaede-Caio. Neither is there any reason to believe that she would have any knowledge regarding who Beatrice is and who committed the murders. Remember that Beatrice is not the one committing the murders if Shannon is a victim of the first scenario. However, my theory explains both the 3rd game and the future perspective perfectly. In fact, everything fits together if Rosa is Beatrice, because if that is true, then Eva was indeed confronted by Beatrice after finding the gold. Don't you think it's just a little bit too much of a coincidence that right after Eva discovered the gold, Rosa is suddenly there as well, congratulating her for finding the gold and solving the epitaph? Supposedly, Rosa was there because she just happened to have solved the epitaph as well, but just a minute too late, which would be an extreme coincidence if you ask me. But if Rosa is Beatrice, she was there to confront Eva for winning the game and handing both the title of the family hat as the title of Beatrice the Golden Witch over to her, since Eva had beat her at her own game. And as the 7th game suggests, Beatrice does keep her word regarding the epitaph as the way to prevent her resurrection. If the epitaph is solved, Beatrice loses and she intends to keep that promise. This even makes sense from the Matter World perspective, as this is beautifully depicted in a magical scene where we see the magical representation of Rosa, namely Beatrice, handing over the family headship and her powers as a witch over to the magical representation of Eva, namely her younger version, who then becomes Eva Beatrice. So I think that this is where Eva learned most of the truth that would later be written in her diary. Just like Beatrice explained about the secret tunnel and the bomb in the 7th game, it is plausible that something similar would have happened in Eva's case. My theory also explains Rosa's death after that, and even the way in which she and Maria died. This is something I haven't explained yet, since I will go into this in the next chapter, but it's about the notion of Rosa not acting alone, but having a second culprit helping her out who doesn't share the exact same motives as her, and therefore has no interest in stopping the murders just because Eva solved the epitaph. If Rosa wanted to pull the plug on the whole murder scheme, but her fellow culprit George had no such intentions, then it's very plausible that this would result in a fight between them. Remember that Rosa's murder in the 3rd game occurs without any weapons and in quite an unusual fashion, which would be difficult to plan out in advance. So I believe that George and Rosa got into a struggle, which Rosa had no chance of winning since George is trained in martial arts, which eventually resulted in Rosa getting thrown on the fence. George then had no choice but to strangle Maria, who was probably completely hysterical after seeing her mother die, so he silenced the witness. Now I will explain about George's motivation in the next chapter, and about the precise details of the 3rd game and Eva's role in it in chapter 8, so I will skip most of the 3rd game for now and move on to the end. At the end of the 3rd game, Eva shoots Battler through his heart and then she escapes to Gorodorian. Even the game results suggest that she survived the 3rd game. I already made clear how she would know about the secret tunnel, the bomb and the identity of Beatrice, but I haven't yet explained why she would keep the truth a secret, why she would rather have people believing that she is the real murderer than to reveal the truth, and why she would shoot Battler and how she would know that George is the second culprit. I will explain this in more detail in chapter 8, but basically in a nutshell I believe that Dr. Nanjo tried to kill George in the parlor in self-defense basically. However, George was merely wounded and unconscious. When Nanjo later quote-unquote discovered George's corpse with Battler, Eva and Jessica, he performed a quick examination and must have realized that George wasn't actually dead. So after taking care of Jessica in the servants' room, he tried to get back to the parlor to finish the job. However, George had already regained consciousness and killed Nanjo in the hallway. In my original Umineko Explained video, I hypothesized that George died an accidental death after that due to his blood loss. But I no longer believe that. After all, we need to make some sense of Eva shooting Battler and Eva hiding the truth at all cost. First, let's analyze things a bit. Kraus and Natsui's corpses were found around 6 p.m. Battler was killed by Eva at 11:15 p.m. Nanjo died a relatively short time after the discovery of George's quote-unquote corpse, which happened right after the discovery of Kraus and Natsui's corpses, so let's say around 7 p.m. This means that we don't get to witness almost 4 hours of the end part of the 3rd game. That's a pretty long time, and since we don't know what happened during that time, we don't know if Eva was with Battler the whole time after Nanjo's murder. We don't know exactly what happened to Jessica. All we know is that Eva and Battler couldn't find her when they discovered Nanjo's corpse. They might have found her in the parlor where she supposedly would have been according to the magical perspective where she was rescued by Ghost Cannon, but that's never shown. So she could be stumbling somewhere around the mansion or something, but in the end we simply have no objective information on her whereabouts. All we know is that George did die before her, so she should not have been killed by George. It is confirmed in red that Jessica is among the last 3 survivors. We don't know exactly what happened to Island Battler in between the time that Nanjo was murdered and him getting shot by Eva. We know that he was with Eva the whole time until Nanjo was murdered, since that is stated in red, but we don't know if Eva was with him during the time after Nanjo was murdered. At least we don't know if she was with him the whole time. So if George is the one who is murdering everyone in the 3rd game, including Rosa, and has now also killed the accomplice Dr. Nanjo, as I said, we don't know what happened to Jessica, but she would be the least of George's worries given the state she was in. But anyway, there was no reason to believe that George would stop there, so George would then go after his mother and Battler as his final victims. So I believe the following, that a confrontation between Eva and George took place somewhere after Nanjo's death and before Battler was killed. This is where she learned the final piece of the puzzle, that her own son was the second culprit and that he even killed Hideyoshi. Now George was out to kill Eva. However, him being wounded and Eva being armed with a rifle, George would probably not win this fight with his mother. So I believe that Eva was forced to kill her own son. So that's the final piece of the puzzle. Eva knows the full truth, which includes the fact that her very own son is the cold-blooded murderer of Rukijima. And that's what the world would come to know unless she would prevent it. So she chose to use the bomb of which Rosa told her in order to create a cat box, and she would even be prepared to be seen as the murderer as long as her son's guilt would remain a secret. But of course, the only person standing in her way would be the other survivor, Battler. So she decided to do what was necessary in order to protect her son's honor, and shoot Battler since he was a witness. Jessica's location is unknown, but given that she was blinded, she would never be able to escape and therefore died in the explosion. So Eva went to the underground VIP room and escaped to Koudorian using the secret tunnel. I believe she already went to arm the bomb after she killed Krause and Natsui, and was very surprised to learn that their corpses had disappeared and were suddenly under the arbor with stakes on their legs. But I'll explain that in chapter 8 when explaining the entire third game. So Eva escaped, and then the mansion and its surroundings blew up, including Jessica, and this gave rise to the future perspective of Angie, in which Eva is the sole survivor who has the real truth locked away inside her diary. And she protected the secret until the day she died. I believe that the Eva Beatrice character represents the illusion of Eva being the culprit, covering up for the murders committed by George. Now it may seem like this necessitates that the third game is the real 2 days of the murders on Rukijima. But that's not necessarily the case at all. After all, we only know that Eva's diary contains the truth, but we don't really know what exactly she wrote down, and we also don't know if absolutely everything she wrote there is true. The red only says that the truth is written within that diary, so as long as all of the first 4 games have the same culprits, which I believe they have, then no matter which one of those games is the real 2 days on Rukijima, there is no conflict with Eva's diary in a counterfactual future containing the truth. So my theory not only explains how Eva knew about the bomb and the secret tunnel, but also how she could have known the truth to write in her diary. The official explanation cannot account for Eva escaping in the third game, since Shannon necessarily died at the first Twilight. And Eva knowing the truth simply remains an inexplicable mystery from the perspective of the official explanation. In the 7th novel, we learn from Will's conversation with Maria that she claims to only have met Beatrice on the island, which would on face value suggest that Beatrice is someone who lived on the island. However, we need to take into account what the reason is that Beatrice supposedly cannot appear to Maria outside of the island. This reason is, in Maria's words, that Beatrice isn't yet capable to sustain her form outside of Rukijima. However, since the whole Beatrice character is essentially just make-believe, this rule is in the end arbitrary. It's either out of necessity, so if Shannon indeed would be Beatrice, she would more or less be stuck on the island, and or part of the character of the Beatrice personality. However, if it is not out of necessity, then this rule can be broken, even if it is out of character for Beatrice, as long as there is some emotional need for both Maria and Beatrice to break this rule. So, does this in fact happen? Even though Maria claims that Beatrice can only appear to her on Rukijima, or in other words, the rules say that, is this actually contradicted by Maria's own testimony, in which Beatrice does appear to her outside of the island, and in fact in her very own home? And yes, there is. There is an account in Maria's diary in which Beatrice appears to her at her home. Namely the scenario in the 4th novel when Rosa tears her beloved stuffed animal Sakura apart. After that happens, Beatrice appears to Maria to comfort her. And then we see the scene in which Beatrice grants Maria the ability to kill her mother over 100 times in a row. Now we have to take into account that this is a magical perspective scene, so how should this scene be interpreted? Remember that every time when Rosa has been abusive towards Maria, later on she regrets it and makes up with Maria again. So it is to be expected that after she violently tore apart Sakura, she would probably soon regret it. But obviously this act was incredibly painful for Maria that a simple apology wouldn't do. No, this was a moment when Maria needed Beatrice, So even though it was against the rules, the Rokkinjima witch appeared to comfort her and to provide her with the opportunity to have her revenge. Now this may seem like a violation of what I said earlier, that Beatrice couldn't possibly appear to the person acting out her persona. However, that isn't necessary for this scene to begin with. In fact, even in the magic torture scene, Rosa never even acknowledges Beatrice in any way in the first place. She talks to Maria, but she never even mentions Beatrice standing next to her. But since this torture scene could never have happened in reality in the first place, there is no need to even suggest that Beatrice appear to Rosa. The only thing that is necessary is that she appear to Maria. First of all, the Rosa in the torture scene should not be regarded as an accurate depiction of Rosa herself, as she is inhumanly cruel in that scene. Even though Rosa is indeed very cruel to Maria in the real world, she is still shown to love Maria. So I see the Rosa in the magic torture scene as a representation of the evil side of Rosa, and Beatrice as her good side. In other words, you should regard the Rosa who is being tortured as the worst possible mother in Maria's eyes, and Beatrice as the perfect mother. So the one being punished should not literally be regarded as Rosa herself, but as the most evil side of her. In fact, that's how Maria basically refers to her in that scene. So how would the magic torture scene have played out in the real world? Well, here I can only speculate since I have no actual information outside of the magical perspective. So let me just give a possible way it could have played out. But this is of course just an example. After Rosa came to her senses after ripping Sakura apart, she knew that she would be unable to make up for what she did unless she did something dramatic. So she acted out her Beatrice persona, who would be the only person Maria would listen to and would want to listen to, even though this was quote-unquote against the rules. Since Maria would no longer recognize Rosa as her usual mother, it would be possible for her and Maria to hurt her abusive mother, or specifically the Black Witch as Maria called the bad side of her mother. In the magical depiction of this scene, Maria tears apart the actual body of her mother, but in real life this might have been something that represented Rosa, like some of her belongings for example. I can't know that of course, but a possible way for Rosa to have made up for what she did is to go around the house with her daughter as her Beatrice persona and have Maria smash some of her own belongings apart. That would have been Maria's revenge. Her evil mother took what was precious to her away from her, so Beatrice then allowed Maria to repeatedly destroy things that were precious to her mother. That would be a way of making sense of this scene, and it would account for Maria meeting Beatrice at her very home and actually getting some sort of revenge, even though according to the rules she could only meet Beatrice on Rokkinjima. Another thing that is very interesting regarding the scene in which Sakura gets torn apart is the fact that Beatrice, despite being the Endless Witch, is incapable of reviving Sakura. The reason for this is in her own words because Rosa denied him and she was the one who made him in the first place. So why does it need to be specifically mentioned that Sakura cannot be revived because Rosa denied him? What is more or less implied is that only Rosa would be able to give Sakura life again, because she's the one who brought him into existence in the first place. So if Rosa made Sakura and then destroyed him, and wouldn't want to make a new one or repair this one, remember that the reason Rosa tore Sakura apart was because of the way Maria was acting with it in front of other people. And if Rosa and Beatrice are the same person, then it would make sense that Beatrice wouldn't be capable to resurrect Sakura. So Rosa wasn't planning on making a new Sakura, and therefore Beatrice wasn't able to resurrect Sakura. Another thing that was actually one of the first things that originally led me to believe that Rosa and Beatrice are the same person is the fact that Maria already refers to her mother as a witch, namely a black evil witch when she gets mad and abuses her. So if it is true what Will said, that behavior determines when Maria recognizes someone as Beatrice, and we know that Maria regards her mother as an evil witch when she is mad, it wouldn't be a stretch if she regards her mother as a different type of witch when she acts in a different way. This also ties into Maria's twisted personality. She almost acts like she has a split personality sometimes. One of the times this happens in the fourth novel, she even refers to herself as a witch. After all, she is Beatrice's apprentice. So where does this behavior come from? Obviously, being mistreated by Rosa so much would almost unavoidably damage her personality. But what is more likely is that she learned this behavior from a role model in her life, which at her age would primarily be her mother. Therefore, I believe that Maria is basically mimicking Rosa in a sense. After all, Rosa has many faces herself. Rosa is definitely one yet many. Maria not only acts like she has a split personality, but she also knows a lot about black magic. However, we know that Rosa hates it when she mentions anything regarding that subject around other people, especially the other family members. However, if Rosa would be so against Maria's black magic interests, then she would be in the position to put a stop to it, or to never have allowed it to begin in the first place. After all, Maria can't just look things up on the internet or something. She basically needs her mother to get access to books on black magic and such in the first place, regardless of the fact that her mother is away from home so often. I mean, Rosa still has access to Maria's room and such. So I doubt that Rosa really is that opposed to her daughter being into black magic. I think she is only against Maria mentioning black magic in the presence of other people. I talk more about this in the next chapter regarding Rosa's motivations, but I believe that Rosa herself is into black magic. But she also makes sure to keep that a secret to the rest of the family. Maria was basically dragged into Rosa's hobby due to Rosa choosing her as the first person to acknowledge her as a witch, and because the whole issue of the virgin birth thing from the 7th novel. So I believe that both Rosa and Maria are into black magic, but Maria likes to talk about that in public, while Rosa wants to keep it a secret. Which explains why Maria has and keeps having access to materials on black magic, but gets scolded by Rosa whenever she mentions magic related subjects in public. Another interesting thing is that the demon Gab, who appears in the 4th novel, actually turns out to have been the prototype for Beatrice, as we learned in the 7th novel. Gab represents the fact that often things go missing as if it was done by magic. This was Yasu's first experience with quote-unquote magic, and interestingly enough, this type of magic is also a big deal to Maria. In the 4th novel, we learn that Maria keeps her room in a sort of memorized chaos. Otherwise, things will go missing. Things disappearing were Yasu's introduction into magic. If things go inexplicably missing, people could interpret it as being done by a witch. The only person who can make things go missing from Maria's room is Rosa. Maria is also the one who gave this principle the name Gab. What is also really interesting is the fact that Gab dresses really unfashionable to the point that her dress is outright ridiculous. Remember that Rosa runs a pretty unsuccessful fashion design company. When Yasu first imagined Gab, Rosa would have been at the start of her fashion career. Given that and the fact that her company is still not very successful, it wouldn't be surprising for her to imagine a witch in an absurd looking outfit. Remember that this is the only version of a witch that was completely imagined out of thin air, so to say, without any quote-unquote model to base it on. Apart from Rosa, there is really no connection between someone's interest in strange fashion and Gab's interest in strange fashion. What I consider to be quite a strong hint that Rosa is Beatrice is the fact that Maria always survives until the end, apart from the 3rd game. However, in the 3rd game she dies together with Rosa. But in the 1st game she doesn't die until the bomb goes off. In the 2nd game we are not sure what happened at the end, but she is at least alive until the end. In the 4th game she is found poisoned next to Rosa's corpse in the dining hall at the end of the game when Battler confirms everyone's death. Especially the parlor murder at the end of the 1st game is interesting, as Maria is the only one left alive there. So she doesn't have to see the corpses lying there. This makes a lot of sense if the culprit is her mother Rosa, who doesn't want to murder her own daughter, or at least if Maria is going to die, she will die together with her, apart from the 3rd game of course, where she is murdered by George. Now I'm not saying that it's 100% inexplicable why Maria survives the parlor murder given the official explanation, because Maria was holding on to the scorpion charm. But if Shannon is Beatrice and the true culprit, then why is Maria never murdered in any of the earlier murder scenarios? You could say that it's because Maria is her friend, but that's a bad argument. After all, Kumasawa is also really important to Shannon, and she has no problem blowing her face off, slitting her throat and hanging her from the ceiling. And the fact that Maria is just a kid is also not very convincing. The culprit was okay with tearing people's faces apart and ripping all their guts out, so that doesn't come across like someone who would show mercy to a child just for being a child. Of course, as I said, Maria was holding on to the scorpion charm during the parlor murder, but that assumes that Beatrice knew this and doesn't explain Maria's late death in the second and in the fourth game. But Maria being the culprit's daughter makes a lot more sense. This is especially true at the end of the fourth game, when Battle discovered Maria poisoned next to Rosa's corpse. It is not that simple to get someone to swallow poison. Of course, Shannon being a servant could have snuck poison into Maria's dinner, but that implies that this poison murder was planned already when they were having dinner. But anyway, why would she specifically choose to poison Maria? I think it's much more likely that Maria was poisoned by her mother in a murder-suicide. So first she gave her daughter a gentle death, and then she blew her own face off and fell on top of the gun, or used another method that I will explain when dealing with the murders of the fourth game. In my opinion, this makes a lot more sense than Shannon arbitrarily using poison on Maria and keeping her alive until the end just because she is on friendly terms with her. The following argument may not be considered to be a very strong argument, since it deals with a magical perspective scene of which very little can be verified. And that's the scene from the second game in which the island version of Beatrice fixes Maria's broken Halloween candy. The reason this scene is so interesting is because if this scene represents the person who represents Beatrice using a simple trick to switch Maria's broken candy for a new one, then it becomes a very good piece of evidence for that person being Rosa and definitely not Shannon. The reason for that is because Rosa had bought several of those Halloween marshmallow pumpkins for Maria. One of which Maria gives to Battler, and one of which Rosa crushes when she scolds Maria. In other words, it would have been easy for Rosa to switch the crushed one with a new one she was still holding on to, when Maria had to close her eyes. Remember that Maria had to close her eyes every time Beatrice performs magic because of the so-called anti-magic toxin. But if Beatrice is Shannon, or anyone else, then how did they get their hands on one of those pumpkins? Were they just coincidentally the exact same type of candy in the mansion or something? At the very least there is no such hint anywhere, but we do know that Rosa bought several of those pumpkins. Now people will probably object that this is a magic scene and therefore there is no guarantee that any of this even really happened. But you have to consider two things, namely that Maria claimed that Beatrice fixed her candy and that Rosa told the other family members that she and Maria had met Beatrice. Therefore I see that magical scene as a representation of Rosa making up for breaking Maria's candy by magically fixing it as Beatrice. Now some people may object again that I said before that Beatrice could never appear to Rosa. But remember that Maria never claimed that Beatrice met her mother, it was Rosa who claimed that she and Maria met Beatrice. Maria doesn't say anything about Beatrice having spoken or even appeared to her mother. It's simply Rosa's claim that she did. What also should be noticed is the fact that after the candy trick scene takes place, Beatrice, which is either Rosa wearing a disguise as I believe, or Shannon without her usual disguise, meets both Genji and Kyrie in the hallway. So Rosa left the parlor to look for Maria, and later someone who is basically completely innocent, namely Kyrie, witnesses a woman dressed like Beatrice. If Rosa had not left the parlor earlier, this would have been a major conflict for my Rosa's Beatrice theory. But the island version of Beatrice appears just when Rosa is supposedly somewhere with Maria out of everyone's sight. Not only that, when Kyrie returns to the parlor, Rosa hasn't come back yet. Which makes sense since Beatrice went upstairs with Genji. But other than that, there would be no reason for Rosa not having returned to the parlor since Maria had in fact already returned to the cousins. The following arguments are based on Rosa's behavior during the second game. First of all, as far as I can tell, whether you believe in the official explanation or not, you are forced to invoke Rosa's involvement to explain the second game. I'll explain why in a minute, but I suppose that believers in the official explanation know this already and believe that Rosa is Shannon's accomplice in the second game, just like they are forced to believe that Hideyoshi is an accomplice in the first game. But however you take it, Rosa's involvement in the second game is a necessity. If anyone can explain the second game without Rosa, then be my guest. So basically it's like this: what fits the best? Rosa as an accomplice in only the second game, or that Rosa's involvement is necessary because she is the main culprit to start with? In my opinion, invoking accomplices arbitrarily is a weak point in any theory. So what reason other than the fact that you can't explain the second game without Rosa is there to think that she would aid Shannon in her murder scheme? I guess the only reason would be the gold. However, you can't consistently suppose that the epitaph was solved, since that would put a stop to the murders in the first place. After all, both in the third game after the epitaph was solved and the fifth game entirely are suggested to not have been carried out by Beatrice in the first place. So I guess you would have to suppose that Shannon simply offered Rosa some gold in order to get her to cooperate. Basically just how Krause and Natsui are made into accomplices in Umineko Our Confession. But what evidence is there to support any of this? And also, why would Shannon need to do that in the first place? Why involve Rosa, which would be in fact a very dangerous move? This is again such a case of a character acting like a moron. I will go into the details about the problems of having many accomplices in the chapter on Umineko Our Confession, but one needs to realize that accomplices are the most dangerous people for a culprit when they don't share the same motives as they do. If accomplices are bribed or forced, you can expect retaliation at any unguarded moment, especially when you consider that Rosa carries a gun during most of the game. If she really wanted the money, she wouldn't need to listen to Shannon in the first place. Rosa would be then calling the shots. Rosa would have access to 3 gold bars and perhaps the keycard to the money as well, so it would be the most dangerous and outright moronic move on Shannon's part to involve Rosa. Shannon wouldn't even have any need for Rosa's involvement if she just had set up the chapel closed room just slightly different in order to not need any help at all from Rosa. In other words, the notion of Rosa as Shannon's accomplice in the second game doesn't make much sense from both Rosa's and Shannon's perspective. It has no evidence other than the fact that you can't get around Rosa's involvement, and it lacks elegance to invoke someone as an accomplice just for a single game, when I can explain all 5 games with the same 3 individuals. But why is Rosa's involvement necessitated in the first place? First of all, Rosa knows about Kinzo's death. Twice in the second game it becomes clear that Rosa is aware that Kinzo is already dead. After all, after the chapel murder, Rosa goes to Kinzo's study in order to borrow his gun for protection. And later on in Jessica's room, she affirms that she has even talked to Kinzo there. But given the fact that Kinzo is already dead, that would be impossible. So we can conclude that Rosa knows that Kinzo is already dead, but that she is pretending like he is still alive, and that she has borrowed his gun directly from him. Is this because of arbitrarily being Shannon's accomplice, or is it because she herself has become the new head of the family when Kinzo died? Because she is Beatrice and was there when Kinzo died before he handed everything over to her. And then there is the letter in the parlor. After the final murder scenario in Natsui's room, Rosa, Batter and Maria return to the parlor again, which had been a perfect closed room just like Natsui's room was. This is even confirmed in red. So the parlor was locked after they left to check on Nanjo's and Kumasawa's corpses, and was still locked when they returned. Rosa was holding all of the master keys, and the parlor key itself was locked inside the servants' room, which was also a closed room that required a master key to open it. In other words, it was impossible for Genji to place the final letter in the parlor, and everyone else is dead at this point. So if you believe that Shannon is the culprit and committed suicide in Natsui's room, which is the official explanation that she did, by the way, then how could she possibly have placed the letter in the parlor? Since Batter himself cannot be an accomplice, since he is the detective, and since it makes little sense to claim that Maria placed the letter there, after all she really believes in magic and she also believed that Beatrice put the letter there, the only possible candidate would be Rosa. She was the first to enter the parlor and could easily have placed the letter there before Batter noticed it. Even more so, I think Rosa had a motive for using this letter. After all, it was because of this letter that she had a reason to separate from Battler, who was then forced to move to the dining hall. So we have one of the witch's letters that could only have been placed there by Rosa. Is this also because she just happens to be Shannon's accomplice, whom she knows to be dead already at this point? Or is it because she was the one who wrote those letters in the first place? The next reason that Rosa's involvement is required in the second game is because you need her to have lied about the chapel being locked and then pretending to unlock it with a key. Again, if anyone can explain the chapel closed room with the chapel truly being locked, then be my guest. I guess the only way this could be done is to claim that Maria locked the chapel door. But this makes no sense at all. After all, Maria really believes in magic, so having to lock a door for Beatrice makes little sense. Also, given that the rat is contingent upon how the culprit chose to carry out the murder scenario, it wouldn't make sense to have Maria lock it in the first place. After all, from the perspective of the real world, there would be no difference for anyone if Shannon locked the door and sealed it in the envelope again, or if Maria did this. The only reason why you would have to invoke Maria herself is due to the red truth, which is unknown to the actual people on the island. Furthermore, Will's solution to this scenario makes it quite clear that the lock itself is the illusion. The chapel was never locked to begin with, but everyone simply believed that it was. The servants assumed it to be locked because it was always locked and the key was missing. Rosa was the only person who actually tried to open it, but she claimed that it was locked. She also was the one to supposedly unlock it after she retrieved the key from the envelope in Maria's handbag. She simply could have pretended to unlock it. After all, everyone was already convinced that the chapel was locked and they saw that Rosa had the real chapel key. So it would have been easy for her to fool everyone into believing that she truly unlocked the door to the chapel. Another interesting thing is that the words Happy Halloween for Maria were written on the chapel. You could suppose that Shannon did this for Maria, but isn't it more likely that Rosa did this as another apology for crushing her Halloween candy? Which would be quite sick of her actually, but given that the murder scenario itself involved ripping people's guts out, that would hardly be a surprise. But what is most interesting about the chapel murder is the scene that happens right before it. It is a magical perspective scene and therefore not objective, but if this scene is a representation of something that happened in reality, it becomes extremely meaningful. In this scene, we see all of the siblings and their spouses in the chapel together with the island version of Beatrice. All of them acknowledged her as a witch and that the gold belongs to her. But Rosa is also depicted in this scene. However, she was not among the victims of the chapel murders, while the other 6 were. I believe that this scene represents how the 6 of them acknowledged Rosa as the new head of the family just before they became her victims. Basically, that is what the magical perspective depicts. Translate that to the real world and this would be an extremely consistent and logical interpretation of this scene. So those are the reasons that Rosa's involvement is necessitated in the second game. But there are some more interesting things regarding Rosa in the second game. We know that both Shannon and Cannon refer to themselves as furniture, and this is also how Beatrice calls her own servants. In the previous chapter I already referred to the supposed origin of the term, which came from Yasu referring to the state of her own body as incapable of love. I already explained that I don't interpret this to mean anything physical, as the official explanation suggests. Instead, I believe its meaning to simply being the most obvious meaning, namely the low social status of a servant. After all, not only Shannon and Cannon refer to themselves as furniture, but Genji does so as well. So that already kind of puts into doubt that it refers to the state of Yasu's body. However, other people never refer to the servants as furniture at all. Jessica even hates the term and doesn't want Cannon to call himself like that. But there is someone who does refer to the servants as furniture. In the second game, when Rosa forced Goda, Genji and Shannon to give her their master keys, and after they left the servants' room, she said the following thing.
僕も彼らと一緒に行くよ。
長司様。
僕は僕の判断で行動します。
信用できないわよ、各どもが。マスターキーは全部で5つ。
Kind of interesting that Rosa calls the servants furniture in the scene. The only people we ever see using the term are the 3 of the servants themselves and Beatrice. I guess this is not overwhelmingly convincing evidence, but I find it very interesting nevertheless. Especially if you consider that the term furniture is also connected to Yasu. I want to end this chapter with perhaps one of the most interesting arguments for Rosa being Beatrice. one which could be at the same level as the Eva's escape to Ecuadorian argument, if it weren't for the fact that we are not dealing with a completely objective scene here, meaning that believers in the official explanation, or simply disbelievers in the Rosa as Beatrice theory, have more elbow room available to wiggle out of the implication of this argument. At 30 minutes till midnight, a while after Rosa forced Battler out of the parlor due to the letter that was found there, the emotionally broken down Battler is seen being drunk in the dining hall. Then Genji shows up and says that it's time for Battler to learn the truth directly from her. Genji then takes Battler to Kinzo's study and a magical perspective scene begins. In this scene we see Kinzo and the island version of Beatrice and a confrontation between her and Beatrice in which Battler surrenders to Beatrice. She then tells him that she will answer any question he has, but we are never shown what exactly happens after that. Now since Battler sees Kinzo and the gold butterflies, we know that this perspective cannot be completely objective anymore at this point in time. So how should this scene then be interpreted? There are many different approaches possible, but the main thing we need to consider here is that it's still before midnight. In other words, the bomb hasn't gone off yet. So how is it possible that we see magical things happen from what should be the objective perspective, namely the island version of Battler? First of all, what could believers in the official explanation at least not accept? Since Shannon is definitely dead at this point in time, as she supposedly committed suicide in Natsui's room, it would be impossible for believers in the official explanation to actually accept that this scene is a representation of something that happens in reality. Meaning that Battler actually had a confrontation with Beatrice here, which was, so to say, colored by his emotional breakdown and him being drunk, and therefore not actually presented completely accurate. You can already guess that that's exactly what I believe this scene represents, but believers in the official explanation are forced to reject such an interpretation. So how could they account for this scene? You could suppose, I guess, that Battler had been shot by Rosa in the parlor, just like he got shot by Eva at the end of the third game. This is however a very bad explanation that has no actual evidence to begin with. Moreover, it should already be clear that the letter in the parlor was placed there by Rosa, so if she indeed was Shannon's accomplice and she needed to get off the island, she could just have shot Battler at any time. That final letter would make no sense that way. But the letter does make sense if Rosa needed an excuse to separate from Battler, which is why he was forced to move to the dining hall in the first place. The most consistent explanation, and the one that I believe, would be that Battler's perspective is simply no longer objective due to him being drunk and being an emotional wreck at this point in time. In fact, this would also be the most consistent approach for believers in the official explanation. But if that's the case, how should we interpret the scene in which he sees Beatrice? Should this simply be dismissed in the sense that this never happened in the first place? Battler passed out or something and he simply dreamed this last bit? I guess I couldn't really complain if believers in the official explanation would take this position, since I basically dismissed the scene in which Rosa and Maria flee from the goats while carrying the gold from the chapel as well. However, if the confrontation scene with Island Beatrice is meant to be a subjective representation of what Battler did experience at that time, then it would be powerful evidence for Rosa being Beatrice instead of Shannon. After all, if the only reason this scene is distorted, so to say, because Battler is drunk and emotionally broken down, but it does really happen in the sense that Genji really took Battler to the study and that he really met Beatrice there, and probably even that Kinzo's corpse was there, then this scene becomes inexplicable given the official explanation. After all, Shannon has committed suicide in Natsui's room according to the official explanation, so it would be impossible for her to appear as Beatrice to Battler at this time. The only people alive at this point are Battler, Genji, Maria and Rosa. If my theory is correct, then this scene would indeed be just a distorted version of the actual confrontation between Battler and Rosa. A bit like when Beatrice and Battler meet at the end of the fourth game, although that scene was not distorted of course. Also, he didn't actually see Kinzo there, since that is impossible due to the rat, so the appearance of Kinzo should be regarded in a sort of similar way as in the fourth novel. Beatrice is the new Kinzo since she is the family head. Or it's possible that Battler saw Kinzo's corpse, which in the scene itself is merely depicted as the living Kinzo to the viewer. And the scene in which we see Rosa and Maria trying to escape the island with the gold bar from the chapel is simply put there as support for the deception of the official explanation. After all, since Rosa's involvement is necessitated in the second game, the official explanation needs to incorporate some motive for Rosa to serve as an accomplice, which of course would be money. But to borrow Battler's phrase, if we turn the chessboard around, If the official explanation really would be true, then why did Ryukishi add in the scene in which a confrontation between Better and Beatrice takes place when Shannon is already dead and hence cannot be accounted for? What purpose does that scene serve from the perspective of the official explanation? But if the official explanation truly is mere deception, then both scenes make sense. But if the official explanation is supposed to be the truth, then one of those scenes is basically out of place to begin with. I do have a little more to say about this confrontation between Better and Beatrice in the final chapter, since I think it could support the notion that the second game is the actual truth regarding what really happened on Rokinjima. But I'll save that for the end of the video. I also have some more reasons to believe that Rosa is Beatrice, some of which will be discussed in the next chapter, but some of those I will actually save for the chapter on whistleblowing, in which I will support the main premise of my video, that the author is purposefully lying regarding what the truth behind the story is, and that he left hints in both the story itself and in interviews that this is the case. So now I will move on to the motivations of the two culprits Rosa and George and their accomplice Dr. Nanjo. First I will deal with Rosa's motivation, and there I want to tie everything together that I have discussed in this chapter and in the previous one, and then connect everything to what we see happening in the 7th novel, and how Rosa is connected to Better's sin against Shannon.